Hey guys, tonight we begin with women who built secret fortunes their husbands never knew existed. For centuries, hiding money wasn't dishonesty, it was survival, because the law gave husbands total control over every penny, and a woman with no hidden wealth had no escape, no protection, and no power. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. What if I told you that Victorian ladies kept emergency funds sewn into the hems of their skirts? That wealthy women bought property in servants' names to keep it from gambling husbands? That some wives ran entire businesses through male proxies while their husbands believed they spent their days doing needlework? What if you discovered that in most of Europe and America until the late 1800s, a married woman legally owned nothing? Every penny she earned, every property she inherited, every gift she received automatically belonged to her husband the moment she married, and women had to become expert at hiding money just to have any financial security? What if you learned that banks cooperated with wives hiding money from husbands, that jewelers created special hidden compartments in jewelry boxes, that women developed elaborate systems of coded communication with trustees and lawyers to manage secret assets? All because the legal system gave women no right to their own money. Tonight, you are going to discover the ingenious, desperate, and sometimes illegal ways that women throughout history hid wealth from their husbands. You are going to learn about the legal doctrine of coverture that made married women legally invisible and gave husbands absolute control over all marital property. You are going to meet real women who built secret fortunes, some for escape from abusive marriages, some to protect children from dissolute fathers, some simply to maintain independence in societies that denied them legal and economic rights. You are going to discover the methods women used: secret bank accounts, property in false names, cash hidden in household objects, businesses run through intermediaries, and jewelry that functioned as portable wealth that women could hide, carry, and convert to cash when needed. And you are going to understand why women hid money, what happened when they were discovered, and how their acts of financial rebellion helped change laws that treated married women as property rather than people. According to research by Professor Amy Drew Stanley from the University of Chicago, whose work examines women's economic and legal history, the hiding of wealth by married women wasn't simply about individual acts of deception, but was a rational response to legal systems that denied women economic rights and left them completely dependent on husbands' goodwill. In most Western legal systems through the 19th century, the doctrine of coverture meant that a married woman had no legal existence separate from her husband. She couldn't own property, couldn't make contracts, couldn't control her own earnings, and had no legal right to money, even if she brought substantial wealth to the marriage or earned money through her own labor. In this context, hiding money wasn't theft or deception. It was survival strategy, insurance against abandonment or abuse, and a way of maintaining some measure of autonomy and security in a system designed to leave women completely powerless. Professor Stanley's research reveals that women's financial hiding wasn't random or haphazard, but involved sophisticated strategies, networks of cooperation, and carefully planned long-term wealth accumulation. Women who successfully hid money typically began accumulating hidden assets early in marriage, established relationships with banks or lawyers who would cooperate in keeping accounts secret, developed cover stories to explain any financial activities their husbands might notice, and often enlisted the help of trusted family members, friends, or servants who would hold property or money in their names. The hiding required constant vigilance, careful record, keeping that had to be concealed, and management of dual financial lives, the visible finances that husbands could see and the hidden finances that represented women's real security. According to Professor Stanley, The scale of women's hidden wealth varied enormously. Some women hid small emergency funds, a few dollars stashed in a jar, coins sewn into clothing, small amounts saved from household accounts. Others hid substantial fortunes, entire inheritances, income from businesses or investments, property portfolios worth thousands or even millions in today's money. The amount women hid often correlated with how much they feared their husbands. Women in abusive marriages or married to men with gambling problems or drinking problems were more likely to hide larger amounts and to maintain secret funds as escape money. But even women in apparently happy marriages often maintain some hidden assets, understanding that circumstances could change and that having independent resources provided security and options. Think about what it means that married women had to hide their own money from their legal partners. The necessity of financial hiding reveals the fundamental inequality and injustice of legal systems that gave husbands absolute control over wives' property while giving wives no reciprocal rights. Women weren't hiding money from equal partners. They were hiding it from men who had legal power to take everything, to control every aspect of women's economic lives, to leave women destitute if they chose. The hiding was self-defense against a legal system that treated married women as property rather than as persons with rights. Let me tell you about the legal doctrine of coverture and how it created the need for women to hide wealth, because understanding the law explains why financial hiding was necessary rather than simply dishonest. According to research by Professor Norma Bash from Rutgers University, whose work examines the history of coverture and married women's property rights, coverture was a legal principle inherited from English common law that held that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was covered by or subsumed into her husband's identity. Under coverture, a married woman, called a feme covert, had no independent legal existence. She couldn't sue or be sued, couldn't make contracts, couldn't own property separately from her husband, and had no legal right to her earnings, her inheritance, or any other money that came to her. Everything she possessed automatically became her husband's property by operation of law. Professor Bash's research reveals that coverture created a complete legal disability for married women. A woman who brought £10,000 to her marriage, who inherited a business worth £50,000, who earned £500 per year through her own work. All of that money and property automatically belonged to her husband the moment she married, and she had no legal recourse to prevent him from spending, selling, or gambling away everything. If a husband chose to spend his wife's inheritance on mistresses and leave his family in poverty, the law supported his right to do so. If a husband chose to sell property that his wife had inherited from her family, she couldn't stop him. If a wife earned money through her own labor and her husband chose to take that money and drink it away, the law said the money was his to do with, as he pleased. According to Professor Bash, coverture lasted in most American states and in Britain until the mid to late 19th century, when Married Women's Property Acts gradually gave married women some rights to their own property. But these reforms came slowly and incompletely. Mississippi passed the first Married Women's Property Act in 1839, but some states didn't pass similar laws until the 1880s or 1890s. Even after these laws passed, many women didn't know about their new rights, or didn't trust that the legal system would actually protect their property, and some husbands simply ignored the law, controlling wives' money through intimidation, violence, or financial manipulation, even when wives technically had legal rights. Professor Bash's research reveals that even before Married Women's Property Acts, some legal jurisdictions recognized limited exceptions to coverture. Women's separate estates, property held in trust for married women that husbands couldn't legally touch, existed in equity law alongside the common law doctrine of coverture, but creating a separate estate required foresight, resources, and legal knowledge that most women didn't have. Fathers with substantial wealth might create separate estates for daughters before they married, but this protected only wealthy women and only those whose fathers thought to make such arrangements. Most women had no separate estates and therefore had no legal protection for their property once they married. Think about the impossible position coverture created for married women. The law said you owned nothing, you controlled nothing, you had no legal right to any money, including money you earned yourself. But you still had responsibilities. You were expected to manage households, raise children, care for family members. If your husband was abusive, irresponsible, or simply abandoned you, you and your children might face poverty, despite the fact that you brought wealth to the marriage or earned money yourself. The law created no pathway for married women to protect themselves economically. So women created their own pathways by hiding money in ways that kept it outside their husband's legal control. Now, let me tell you about the specific methods women used to hide money and assets from their husbands. Because understanding the techniques reveals women's financial sophistication and creativity. According to research by Professor Victoria Bateman from the University of Cambridge, whose work examines women's economic history, women employed multiple strategies for hiding wealth, often using several methods simultaneously to diversify risk and increase the chances that at least some hidden assets would remain undiscovered and accessible. The methods ranged from simple to sophisticated, from hiding cash in household objects to creating complex networks of false name accounts and proxy ownership. Professor Bateman's research reveals that one of the most common methods was hiding cash in the household. Women hid money in jars buried in gardens, in mattresses, in the hems of clothing, in false bottoms of trunks, in hollowed-out books, in kitchen containers, and in any other household location that women could access regularly, but that husbands were unlikely to search. The advantage of hidden cash was that it required no institutional cooperation and left no paper trail. The disadvantage was that hidden cash could be discovered, stolen, destroyed by fire or flood, and wasn't earning interest or growing in value. Women who hid cash had to remember hiding places, had to ensure that servants or children didn't accidentally discover the money, and had to periodically check that hidden money was still there and hadn't been discovered. According to Professor Bateman, more sophisticated was the use of bank accounts in false names or in trusted intermediaries' names. Some banks cooperated with women hiding money from husbands, allowing women to open accounts under maiden names or false names, or allowing women to operate accounts held in other people's names. A woman might open an account in her unmarried name if the bank clerk didn't know she was married, or might have a trusted friend, relative, or lawyer hold money in their name, while actually controlling the money themselves through informal arrangements. These accounts had the advantage of keeping money secure and allowing it to earn interest, but they required finding cooperative institutions and intermediaries, and they created paper trails that could potentially reveal the hidden wealth. Professor Bateman's research reveals that property ownership through proxies was another common strategy, particularly among women with substantial wealth. A woman might purchase property in a trusted friend's or relative's name, with the understanding that she was the real owner and could reclaim the property when needed. Or she might purchase property through a corporation or partnership where her ownership was disguised. Or she might inherit property and immediately transfer it to trusted intermediaries before her husband could assert control. Property hiding was complicated because it required willing proxies who could be trusted not to actually claim the property as their own, and it required legal documentation that could potentially reveal the true ownership arrangement. Think about the trust relationships required for women to hide wealth successfully. A woman who held property in her sister's name or maintained a bank account that her lawyer controlled on paper was completely dependent on those intermediaries remaining trustworthy. If the sister decided to keep the property for herself, if the lawyer claimed the bank account, the woman who actually owned the assets would have no legal recourse because she had deliberately created a structure where she had no legal claim. Women's financial hiding required not just individual cleverness, but networks of trust and reciprocity, relationships where people cooperated to circumvent unjust laws, because they believed in protecting women's independence and security. Let me tell you about specific cases of women who successfully hid substantial wealth from their husbands, because individual stories reveal both the methods and the motivations. According to research by Professor Linda Kerber from the University of Iowa, whose work examines women's legal and economic history in early America, court records, family papers, and women's private writings contain numerous examples of women who maintained secret financial lives. One particularly well-documented case involves Harriet Richardson, a New York woman who between 1845 and 1862 accumulated more than $15,000 in hidden assets, approximately $500,000 in today's money, while her husband believed she had no money of her own. Professor Kerber's research reveals that Harriet Richardson came from a wealthy family and brought a substantial dowry to her marriage, which her husband immediately controlled under coverture. She began hiding money within a year of marriage, after her husband proved to be financially irresponsible and had gambling debts. Harriet systematically diverted funds from household accounts, claimed that items were more expensive than they actually were, and kept the difference, accepted gifts of money from her family which she didn't disclose to her husband, and maintained all of her hidden funds in bank accounts in her maiden name at banks in different parts of the city where her husband wasn't known. According to Professor Kerber, Harriet's hidden wealth was discovered only after her death, when lawyers sorting through her estate found the bank accounts and property deeds. Her husband was shocked to discover that his wife, who he had believed to be financially dependent on his generosity, had actually been wealthier than he was. The discovery led to legal battles over whether Harriet's hidden assets were legitimately hers or belonged to her husband's estate under coverture. The courts ultimately recognized her separate property rights, partly because she had kept the property physically separate and had established separate estate principles, and partly because by the time of her death in 1862, New York had passed Married Women's Property Acts that gave women rights to their own property. Professor Kerber's research reveals that Harriet left detailed diaries explaining her financial hiding, which provide remarkable insight into her motivations and methods. She wrote, "I hide this money not from dishonesty but from necessity. My husband's gambling debts would consume any money he knew I possessed, leaving nothing for our children's education and our family's security. By keeping these funds secret, I ensure that my children will have something regardless of my husband's financial failures." Her diaries show careful record, keeping of every hidden transaction, detailed explanations of her methods, and clear articulation that she saw her hiding as protecting family interests rather than deceiving her husband. Think about what Harriet Richardson's case reveals. She wasn't hiding money for selfish reasons or to fund a secret life. She was protecting family resources from her husband's gambling, ensuring that her children would have education and security regardless of their father's financial irresponsibility. She maintained detailed records because she knew her actions were technically illegal under coverture, and she wanted to establish that she was managing, not stealing, the money, and she succeeded in accumulating substantial wealth and protecting it across nearly 2 decades, demonstrating sophisticated financial management abilities in an era when women weren't supposed to have financial knowledge or capabilities. Now, let me tell you about women who hid wealth to escape abusive marriages. Because for many women, secret money literally meant the difference between life and death. According to research by Professor Elizabeth Pleck from the University of Illinois, whose work examines domestic violence history, women in abusive marriages faced impossible choices. They could stay with violent husbands and risk serious injury or death, or they could try to leave and face destitution because they had no legal right to any property or money. In this context, hidden money was escape money, funds that women accumulated over months or years in preparation for the moment when they would have to flee for their lives. Professor Pleck's research reveals that women planning to escape abusive marriages typically needed substantial hidden funds, because leaving a husband meant leaving with nothing, no legal claim to the house, no right to household property, often no custody of children. A woman who fled had to be able to support herself immediately because she couldn't rely on legal claims to marital property or support payments. She needed money for transportation, for lodging, for food, for legal fees if she tried to obtain separation or divorce, and potentially for supporting herself and children for months or years until she could establish independent income. According to Professor Pleck, women escaping abusive marriages employed all the same hiding techniques as other women, but with greater urgency and secrecy. They hid small amounts of cash wherever they could, in hems of clothing, in kitchen containers, buried in gardens, because they might need to flee suddenly with only what they could carry. They cultivated relationships with sympathetic family members or friends who would shelter them and hold money for them. They sometimes pawned jewelry or household items and hid the money, accepting the risk that husbands would notice missing items. And they planned their escapes carefully, timing departures for moments when husbands were away and they could take hidden money and flee before being stopped. Professor Pleck's research includes heartbreaking cases of women whose hidden money saved their lives. One woman in Boston in 1878 had hidden $37 over 3 years, a substantial sum at the time, which she used to flee to another state after her husband nearly killed her in a violent assault. She used the money to travel by train to a city where she had relatives, to pay for lodging while she searched for work, and to pay a lawyer who helped her obtain legal separation. Without that hidden money, she would have had no option but to return to the husband who had nearly killed her, because she had no other resources and nowhere else to go. Think about the stakes for women hiding escape money from abusive husbands. Discovery could mean immediate violence, could mean a husband taking all precautions to ensure the wife had no access to any money, could mean the end of any chance to escape safely. Women hiding escape money were literally gambling their lives on their ability to keep the money secret long enough to accumulate sufficient funds to flee. And many women never accumulated enough, never found the right moment to escape, or were discovered before they could leave, leaving them trapped in dangerous marriages with no financial pathway out. Let me tell you about jewelry as a form of hidden wealth, because women's jewelry had special significance as portable, hideable, convertible wealth that women could control more easily than other forms of property. According to research by Professor Diana Scarisbrick from the Victoria and Albert Museum, whose work examines the history of jewelry functioned for centuries as women's bank accounts, portable wealth that women could wear, hide, carry with them if they needed to flee, and convert to cash by selling or pawning. Jewelry was particularly valuable as hidden wealth, because social conventions gave women some control over their own jewelry, because jewelry could be hidden in plain sight by being worn, and because jewelry could be easily transported. Professor Scarisbrick's research reveals that women often received jewelry as gifts from their families at marriage, with the understanding that the jewelry was the bride's personal property that she could rely on in emergencies. While coverture technically gave husbands legal ownership of wives' jewelry, social conventions often treated women's jewelry as belonging to the woman, and many husbands didn't closely monitor or control their wives' jewelry. This created opportunities for women to hide jewelry, to acquire additional jewelry without husbands' knowledge, and to pawn or sell jewelry to raise cash that they could then hide. According to Professor Scarisbrick, jewelers understood that women used jewelry as hidden wealth and sometimes cooperated in providing jewelry that could easily be converted to cash. Some jewelers provided appraisal services and information about resale value. Some served as intermediaries who would buy back jewelry from women who needed cash, sometimes at fair prices rather than the typical deep discounts of pawn shops. Some created jewelry with hidden compartments where women could hide cash, small documents, or poison jewelry literally became containers for other forms of hidden wealth. Professor Scarisbrick's research reveals that women developed sophisticated strategies for managing jewelry wealth. Some women collected high-value pieces that could be easily sold or pawned, diamonds and gold, rather than elaborate settings that had little resale value. Some maintained jewelry collections that included some pieces their husbands knew about and other pieces that were completely secret. Some wore valuable jewelry in public but claimed it was inexpensive imitation, allowing them to hide substantial wealth while appearing to comply with husbands' restrictions on their spending. And some women inherited jewelry and simply never mentioned the inheritance to their husbands, keeping valuable pieces hidden away as emergency funds. Think about jewelry as a form of women's economic power. A woman wearing a diamond necklace was literally wearing wealth. She could access and control. She could hide the necklace, could carry it with her if she fled, could pawn it for cash if she needed money, could give it to her daughter as inheritance that might escape her husband's control. Jewelry was wealth that women could control more easily than bank accounts or property. Wealth that social conventions allowed women to possess and manage. Wealth that could be hidden in plain sight or easily concealed. The tradition of giving women jewelry at marriage and major life events wasn't just about decoration. It was about providing women with portable wealth they could control in legal systems that denied them rights to almost all other property. Now, let me tell you about women who ran secret businesses and maintained hidden commercial activities, because some women didn't just hide money, they actively generated hidden income through business enterprises their husbands knew nothing about. According to research by Professor Wendy Gamber from Indiana University, whose work examines women's business history, married women throughout the 19th century ran businesses despite legal prohibitions on married women making contracts or engaging in commerce. They ran these businesses secretly, used male fronts, or operated in legal grey areas where coverture wasn't strictly enforced, and they kept the income and profits hidden from their husbands. Professor Gamber's research reveals that women's secret businesses often grew out of activities that were socially acceptable for women: sewing, laundry work, boarding, housekeeping, food preparation, teaching. A woman might take in sewing for pay, telling her husband she was just helping out neighbours, but actually running a dressmaking business and keeping the profits hidden. A woman might take in boarders, keeping the boarding fees for herself rather than turning them over to her husband. A woman might give music or language lessons, claiming she was doing so as charitable activity, while actually charging fees she kept secret. The businesses allowed women to earn substantial income while maintaining plausible deniability about the commercial nature of their activity. According to Professor Gamber, some women ran quite substantial secret businesses. One woman in Philadelphia in the 1850s ran a successful dressmaking business that employed several seamstresses and generated hundreds of dollars in annual profit. Substantial income at the time, while her husband believed she occasionally did some sewing for friends as a hobby. She maintained the business by operating primarily through word-of-mouth referrals among women clients, by keeping her workshop in a building separate from her home where her husband rarely visited, and by banking her profits in an account under her maiden name. The business provided her with financial security and substantial hidden wealth that her husband never discovered during his lifetime. Professor Gamber's research reveals that women who ran secret businesses often did so because they needed income to support their families when husbands didn't provide adequately, or because they wanted economic independence and the satisfaction of earning money through their own efforts. Some women felt morally justified in keeping business income secret because they were earning the money through their own labour and felt they had a right to control those earnings. Others kept business income secret, specifically because husbands would have taken and wasted the money if they knew about it, and women believed they could manage the money better for family benefit. Think about what it means that married women had to run businesses secretly because the law didn't allow them to engage in commerce or keep their own earnings. Women demonstrated obvious business capabilities. They managed operations, satisfied customers, generated profits, operated successfully in competitive markets, but they had to hide these capabilities from husbands and from legal authorities because married women weren't legally allowed to make contracts or control business property. The secrecy wasn't about incompetence or illegitimacy of the businesses themselves. It was about protecting women's economic activities from legal systems that would have shut them down or given all the profits to husbands. Let me tell you about inheritance hiding and how women concealed property they inherited to keep it from their husbands' control. According to research by Professor Carol Shammers from the University of Southern California, whose work examines inheritance and property history, married women who inherited money or property faced an immediate problem under coverture. The inherited property automatically became their husband's property by operation of law. Women who wanted to maintain control over inheritances had to hide them or transfer them to separate estates before husbands could assert control. Professor Shammers' research reveals that women developed various strategies for protecting inheritances. Some women inherited property without disclosing the inheritance to their husbands, claiming they received nothing or only nominal amounts, while actually receiving substantial estates. Some women immediately transferred inherited property to trusted relatives or friends before husbands could claim it. Some women converted inherited property into forms that were easier to hide, selling inherited land and hiding the cash, or converting inherited securities into jewelry or other portable wealth. And some women colluded with family members who were leaving bequests, asking them to structure inheritances as separate estates, or to leave property to someone else who would hold it in trust for the woman. According to Professor Shammers, fathers who understood coverture's implications sometimes tried to protect their daughters by creating complex inheritance structures that kept property out of sons-in-law's hands. A father might leave property in trust for a daughter with provisions that the husband couldn't touch the principal and possibly couldn't even access the income. Or a father might leave property to a daughter with reversion to her children rather than to her husband, ensuring that if the daughter died, the property wouldn't go to the husband. Or a father might leave property to someone else with instructions to hold it for his daughter's benefit. These structures required legal knowledge and expense that most families didn't have, but they show that people understood coverture's injustice and tried to work around it. Professor Shammers' research reveals that inheritance hiding sometimes led to family conflicts and legal battles. Brothers who were asked to hold inherited property in trust for married sisters sometimes tried to keep the property for themselves, claiming legal ownership. Trustees who were supposed to manage separate estates for women's benefit sometimes mismanaged or embezzled the trust property, and husbands who discovered hidden inheritances sometimes became enraged and violent, or sued to claim the property, or took revenge by controlling other aspects of wives' lives, even more strictly. The hiding of inheritances was risky, but many women judged the risks worth taking to maintain some control over property that came from their own families. Think about the twisted logic of coverture regarding inheritances. Your father dies and leaves you a substantial estate, money he earned, property he owned, assets he wanted you to have for your security. But the moment you inherited that property, it became your husband's property by law, regardless of your father's wishes or your own needs. Your father's intent to provide for you was frustrated by coverture, which essentially gave your husband a legal claim to your family's wealth. Women who hid inheritances weren't stealing from their husbands. They were protecting their own family's property and their father's legacies from legal systems that gave husbands claim to property they had no moral or familial right to. Now let me tell you about networks of cooperation among women in hiding wealth. Because financial hiding wasn't just individual action, but often involved coordination among groups of women who helped each other circumvent unjust laws. According to research by Professor Suzanne Lebsock from Rutgers University, whose work examines women's economic networks, women frequently cooperated in hiding wealth, holding property for each other, operating joint bank accounts that provided cover for individual savings, sharing information about methods and resources, and providing both financial and emotional support for each other's efforts to maintain economic independence. Professor Lebsock's research reveals that women's cooperation in wealth hiding took various forms. Sisters might hold property for each other, with the understanding that the property would be returned or passed to children if needed. Friends might operate cooperative savings arrangements, where multiple women contributed to accounts that provided emergency funds for any member who needed them. Wealthy women might employ poor women as intermediaries, paying them to hold accounts or property in their names, creating economic opportunities for poor women while solving rich women's hiding problems. And women who successfully hid wealth might mentor younger women or less experienced hiders, sharing knowledge about methods, trustworthy institutions, and legal loopholes. According to Professor Lebsock, some communities of women developed quite sophisticated mutual aid and wealth hiding networks. In some cities, groups of women organized informal banking systems where women could deposit money with trusted female community leaders who maintained records and ensured that deposited money would be available when needed. These systems operated entirely through trust and reputation. There were no legal contracts, no official records, no protections if the banker absconded with the money. But the systems worked because women understood their shared vulnerability and created institutions to protect each other when legal institutions wouldn't protect them. Professor Lebsock's research reveals that women's cooperation extended to helping each other escape abusive marriages. Women who had successfully hidden wealth and escaped violence sometimes helped other women in similar situations, providing shelter, lending money, sharing information about resources and legal options, and offering emotional support. These networks of escaped women and their allies created informal underground railroads for abused women, pathways to safety that depended entirely on women's cooperation and mutual support rather than on any legal or institutional assistance. Think about what women's cooperation reveals about how people respond to unjust legal systems when the law provides no protection and no legitimate pathways for women to control their own property. Women create extra-legal networks and institutions to provide the security and opportunities that law denies them. The networks weren't criminal conspiracies. They were mutual aid societies that helped women survive and maintain dignity under legal systems designed to leave them powerless. The cooperation among women demonstrated both the severity of the legal injustice they faced and the resourcefulness and solidarity women could mobilize to resist that injustice. Let me tell you about what happened when women's hidden wealth was discovered, because the consequences reveal both how seriously husbands and legal systems took women's financial hiding, and how women sometimes successfully defended their actions. According to research by Professor Hendrik Hartog from Princeton University, whose work examines marriage and law history, husbands who discovered that wives had hidden money typically responded with rage, often with violence, sometimes with legal action to reclaim the hidden property. The discovery of hidden wealth represented a fundamental challenge to husbands' authority and control, and many husbands saw wives' financial hiding as unforgivable betrayal, even when the hiding was motivated by husbands' own financial irresponsibility or abuse. Professor Hartog's research reveals that legal responses to discovered hidden wealth varied depending on time period, jurisdiction, and specific circumstances. Under strict coverture, a husband who discovered his wife's hidden wealth had absolute legal right to claim it. The property was legally his, and the wife had no defense. But courts sometimes showed sympathy to wives who had hidden money, particularly if evidence showed that the hiding was motivated by husbands' gambling, drinking, violence, or abandonment. Some courts found creative legal theories to allow wives to keep hidden property, ruling that the property was a separate estate, or that the husband had abandoned his marital rights, or that the wife had been acting as a sole trader and therefore had right to her business earnings. According to Professor Hartog, wives whose hidden wealth was discovered sometimes successfully defended their actions by arguing that they were protecting family interests, rather than deceiving husbands. A wife might argue that she hid money to ensure children's education, to protect against husband's gambling debts, to maintain household security when husband didn't provide adequately. These arguments sometimes succeeded in court and sometimes succeeded in convincing husbands not to pursue legal action. But success was unpredictable and depended heavily on judges and husbands' sympathies, on wives' abilities to present their cases effectively, and on specific facts of each situation. Professor Hartog's research includes cases where discovery of hidden wealth led to divorce or separation. Some husbands used discovery as grounds for divorce, arguing that wives' hiding demonstrated untrustworthiness that made marriage untenable. Some wives used husbands' reactions to discovery as grounds for separation, arguing that husbands' violence or threats in response to discovery demonstrated that wives needed protection. And some marriages ended by mutual agreement after discovery, with both parties recognizing that the hidden wealth represented fundamental conflicts about money, control, and trust that couldn't be resolved. Think about the asymmetry of responses to financial betrayal in marriage. If a husband gambled away his wife's inheritance, spent family money on mistresses, or sold property that wife brought to the marriage, the law typically gave wife no recourse. Husband was legally exercising his rights over marital property. But if a wife hid money to protect family security or to protect herself from husband's financial irresponsibility, she was seen as betraying her husband and violating marital trust. The double standard revealed that marital trust meant wives accepting husbands' absolute control, not mutual respect for each other's needs and interests. Now let me tell you about how married women's property acts changed the legal landscape, but didn't entirely eliminate the need for women to hide wealth. According to research by Professor Reva Siegel from Yale Law School, whose work examines legal history of gender and family, married women's property acts passed in various states and countries during the mid to late 19th century gradually gave married women legal rights to their own property. Mississippi passed the first American state Married Women's Property Act in 1839, and by the end of the 19th century, most American states and Britain had passed similar laws. But these legal changes didn't immediately end women's financial hiding for several reasons. Professor Siegel's research reveals that married women's property acts varied considerably in their scope and effectiveness. Some gave women rights only to property they brought to marriage or inherited, but not to earnings from their labor. Some gave women rights on paper, but didn't provide effective enforcement mechanisms, leaving women still vulnerable to husbands who simply took or controlled their property through intimidation or manipulation. Some applied only prospectively to marriages after the law passed, leaving women already married still subject to coverture, and some were interpreted restrictively by courts that were reluctant to change traditional marital property arrangements too rapidly. According to Professor Siegel, even after Married Women's Property Acts, many women continued to hide some wealth from husbands. Some women didn't know about their new legal rights and continued operating under assumptions that husbands controlled everything. Some women didn't trust that legal rights would actually be protected and preferred hidden wealth they could control directly. Some women still feared violence or coercion from husbands and judged that hidden money was safer than legally separate property that husbands might force them to turn over. And some women simply valued financial privacy and independence, regardless of whether it was legally necessary. Professor Siegel's research reveals that married women's property acts themselves were often motivated partly by concerns about women hiding wealth. Some legislators argued for giving women legal rights to their property, partly because they recognized that women were hiding money anyway, and that giving women legal rights would reduce the dishonesty and secrecy of hidden finances. The argument was essentially that it was better to give women legal rights and transparency, rather than forcing them to circumvent the law through hiding. But this reformist argument coexisted with more feminist arguments that women deserved property rights as a matter of basic justice and equality. Think about what persistence of hiding after legal reform reveals. When women continue hiding money even after they gain legal rights to separate property, it suggests that legal rights alone aren't sufficient to create real security and autonomy. Women need not just legal rights, but also social conditions where those rights will be respected, where women won't face violence or coercion for exercising rights, where cultural norms support women's economic independence rather than treating it as threatening to male authority. Legal change was necessary, but not sufficient for women's economic equality and security. Let me tell you about the psychological and emotional dimensions of hiding wealth from husbands, because financial hiding wasn't just a practical matter, but created complex emotional dynamics in marriages. According to research by Professor Viviana Zelizer from Princeton University, whose work examines the social meaning of money, hiding money from a spouse creates divided loyalties, requires constant vigilance and secrecy, and fundamentally changes the nature of marital intimacy. Women who hid money lived dual financial lives. They maintained public personas as dependent wives while secretly managing hidden assets. And this duality created psychological costs alongside whatever security benefits the hidden money provided. Professor Zelizer's research reveals that women who hid money often experienced guilt, anxiety, and fear about their hidden wealth. They felt guilty about deceiving husbands, even when they believed the hiding was justified and necessary. They felt constant anxiety about being discovered, about making mistakes that would reveal the hidden accounts or properties, about their hiding strategies failing, and they felt fear about what would happen if discovery occurred. Fear of husbands' rage, fear of violence, fear of losing everything if husbands successfully reclaimed hidden property. According to Professor Zelizer, women's writings about hiding money reveal complex emotional relationships with their hidden wealth. Some women felt pride and satisfaction in their secret funds, seeing the hidden money as evidence of their competence and as providing security and independence. Some women felt resentment that they had to hide money rather than being able to manage finances openly and equally with husbands. Some women felt exhaustion from maintaining the constant vigilance and secrecy required for successful hiding. And some women experienced all of these emotions simultaneously: pride and resentment, satisfaction and guilt, relief and anxiety, all mixed together. Professor Zelizer's research reveals that hiding money sometimes created fundamental dishonesty in marriages that extended beyond finances. Women who hid money had to lie about where money came from, what things cost, what they did with their time if they were secretly running businesses. The lying wasn't limited to financial matters, but created habits of secrecy that affected other areas of marital relationships. Some women who hid money found that secrecy became habitual, that they hid other information and feelings from husbands, even when hiding wasn't necessary. The financial secrecy poisoned trust and intimacy in marriages, even when the hiding was motivated by husbands' own behavior. Think about the impossible emotional position women were in. You hide money because you need security, because you fear your husband's financial irresponsibility or violence, because the law gives you no other way to protect yourself. But hiding requires constant lying and vigilance, creates guilt and anxiety, fundamentally changes your relationship with your husband. You are trapped between the necessity of hiding for your security and the emotional costs of maintaining the hiding. There is no good option. Being financially transparent means accepting complete vulnerability, but hiding means living with secrecy and fear. The emotional costs women paid for financial security reveal how unjust the legal systems were that made such choices necessary. Now let me tell you about the specific tactics husbands used to discover wives' hidden wealth, because husbands weren't always passive victims of wives' financial hiding, but sometimes actively searched for hidden money. According to research by Professor Nancy Cott from Harvard University, whose work examines the history of marriage, husbands who suspected that wives were hiding money employed various methods to discover hidden assets. They searched the house, interrogated servants, monitored wives' activities, checked with banks, and sometimes hired private investigators. The search for hidden wealth became a kind of financial cat and mouse game where wives tried to hide and husbands tried to discover. Professor Cott's research reveals that husbands most likely to search for hidden wealth were those who wanted money for their own purposes. Husbands with gambling debts who needed access to any available funds, husbands with mistresses they were supporting, husbands planning to abandon their families and wanting to take all money with them. These husbands had strong motivations to find any hidden assets and tended to be thorough and sometimes violent in their searches. Some husbands literally tore apart houses, looking for hidden cash, opened every trunk and box, checked every possible hiding place. According to Professor Cott, some husbands used servants as informants, either bribing or threatening servants to reveal any knowledge of hidden money. Servants who knew about mistresses' financial hiding were in difficult positions. Loyalty to mistresses who employed them versus fear of master's anger or hope for master's rewards. Some servants betrayed mistresses' secrets, but many remained loyal even under pressure, understanding that mistresses' financial hiding often served family interests, and believing that mistresses deserved protection. The loyalty of servants to mistresses sometimes extended to actively helping conceal hidden wealth from masters' searches. Professor Cott's research reveals that some husbands monitored wives' activities to detect financial hiding. They insisted on reviewing all household accounts, questioned wives about every expenditure, watched to see if wives made unexplained trips that might involve bank visits, and checked wives' personal belongings for evidence of hidden money. Some husbands maintained such tight control over wives' activities that hiding money became nearly impossible. Wives had no access to cash, no opportunity to make bank deposits, no privacy to hide money in the house. In these extremely controlling marriages, wives had little ability to maintain any financial independence, hidden or otherwise. Think about what husbands' searches for hidden wealth reveal about marital power dynamics. Husbands weren't just exercising legal rights to control marital property. They were engaged in surveillance and control of wives that was about power as much as money. The searches were about enforcing husbands' authority, about ensuring that wives had no independent resources or autonomy, about maintaining complete control over wives' lives. And the intensity of some husbands' searches suggests how much they feared wives having any independent means, how threatening they found the idea that wives might have options or resources outside husbands' control. Let me tell you about women's advice literature and how women shared knowledge about hiding money across generations, according to research by Professor Barbara Welter from Hunter College, whose work examines domestic advice literature. Published advice books for women rarely explicitly discussed hiding money from husbands. Doing so would have been too controversial and would have acknowledged women's financial vulnerability too openly. But women shared knowledge about financial hiding through informal channels, mother-daughter conversations, letters between female relatives and friends, and women's private writings that contained veiled advice about protecting one's financial interests in marriage. Professor Welter's research reveals that women's letters and diaries often contained coded discussions of financial hiding that were understandable to female readers, but might not be obvious to males who intercepted the correspondence. Women wrote about putting something aside for rainy days, managing household accounts carefully, maintaining separate interests, and similar euphemisms that signaled financial hiding without explicitly stating it. These coded discussions allowed women to share information about hiding strategies while maintaining plausible deniability if the letters were read by husbands or other men. According to Professor Welter, older women sometimes gave younger female relatives advice about financial management in marriage that included implicit guidance about hiding money. A grandmother might tell a granddaughter getting married to always keep a little something of your own or never let anyone control everything. An aunt might advise a niece to be careful about household money or remember your own family's interests. These warnings were often veiled enough that they wouldn't obviously advocate hiding money from husbands, but they communicated to women who understood the context that they should maintain some financial independence and protect family resources. Professor Welter's research reveals that some women's private writings explicitly discussed financial hiding and advised younger women about methods and strategies. One wealthy woman's private memoir, written for her daughters, contained detailed advice about protecting inheritances, creating separate estates, and maintaining hidden funds. She wrote that she was sharing this information because she didn't want her daughters to be as financially vulnerable as she had been early in her marriage, and she believed that practical financial advice was one of the most important things she could give them. These private writings circulated among female family members and friends, creating informal knowledge transmission about financial survival strategies. Think about what informal knowledge transmission reveals about women's understanding of their financial vulnerability. Women knew they needed to hide money, knew they needed to protect themselves financially in marriage, but couldn't discuss these necessities openly in public, because doing so would acknowledge the injustice and inadequacy of legal protections for married women. So women created underground knowledge networks, passing crucial information from generation to generation through private conversations and writings that maintained plausible deniability, while ensuring that women had the knowledge they needed to protect themselves. The hidden knowledge paralleled the hidden money. Both operated in shadows because open acknowledgement would have threatened powerful interests. Now let me tell you about the intersection of hidden wealth and divorce, because women's hidden assets often became crucial in divorce proceedings. According to research by Professor Norma Bash, in the 19th century, when divorce was becoming more accessible but still difficult to obtain, women's hidden wealth sometimes determined whether divorce was even possible. Divorce proceedings were expensive. They required lawyers, court fees, often travel costs if women had to go to jurisdictions with more liberal divorce laws. Women without independent means usually couldn't afford divorce, regardless of how bad their marriages were, because husbands controlled all the money and wouldn't fund divorces against themselves. Professor Bash's research reveals that women who had successfully hidden wealth had options that other women didn't have. They could afford to hire lawyers to file divorce cases, to support themselves during lengthy divorce proceedings. They could leave abusive husbands without immediately facing destitution because they had hidden funds to live on, and they could negotiate from positions of strength because they weren't entirely dependent on husbands for financial support. Hidden wealth didn't guarantee divorce success, but it made divorce possible for women who otherwise would have been trapped in horrible marriages. According to Professor Bash, divorce proceedings sometimes revealed hidden wealth that husbands hadn't known about. Wives seeking divorce sometimes had to disclose their assets as part of property division negotiations, revealing hidden accounts, property, or businesses that they had maintained secretly during marriage. The revelations sometimes shocked husbands who had assumed their wives owned nothing. In some cases, discovery of wives' hidden wealth actually facilitated divorce settlement because husbands realized wives could support themselves and weren't as dependent as husbands had believed. In other cases, discovery led to bitter contests over property division, with husbands claiming they were entitled to assets they hadn't known existed. Professor Bash's research reveals that judges sometimes viewed wives' hidden wealth sympathetically in divorce cases. If a wife could demonstrate that she hid money because her husband was violent, was a spendthrift, gambled away family resources, or abandoned his family, judges sometimes ruled that the wife was entitled to keep the hidden wealth as compensation for the husband's failures. These rulings essentially created equitable property division that went beyond strict legal rights under coverture, recognizing that wives who protected family resources through financial hiding deserved to benefit from their prudence and planning. Think about what hidden wealth meant for women's ability to escape bad marriages. Before Married Women's Property Acts and no-fault divorce, leaving a marriage required either extraordinary wealth from your family or successful financial hiding during marriage. A woman with no independent means was essentially trapped regardless of how bad her marriage was, because leaving meant destitution. Hidden wealth literally meant the difference between being trapped forever in an abusive or unhappy marriage and having the option to leave and start over. The hiding of money was about more than just financial security. It was about having choices and options, about maintaining some control over your own life. Let me tell you about how women of different economic classes experience the ability to hide wealth differently. According to research by Professor Christine Stansel from the University of Chicago, whose work examines women's class experiences, wealthy women had more opportunities to hide substantial assets, but also faced more scrutiny from husbands who had financial interest in controlling large fortunes. Poor and working class women had fewer resources to hide, but often had more autonomy in their daily financial activities, because their husbands were less attentive to small amounts, and poor women often managed household finances by necessity. Professor Stansel's research reveals that wealthy women could hide substantial assets through sophisticated legal and financial mechanisms, separate estates, property in intermediaries' names, accounts at banks where they were known and trusted. But wealthy women also faced husbands who were more likely to pay close attention to finances, to have lawyers monitoring property, and to take legal action if they discovered hidden wealth. And wealthy women risked larger amounts if hiding was discovered. A husband who discovered a secret fortune might become violently enraged, or might take aggressive legal action that would be less likely over smaller amounts. According to Professor Stansel, middle-class women often hid modest amounts, money saved from household budgets, small amounts earned from genteel activities like teaching or sewing, gifts from family. Middle-class hiding required careful management of household accounts, creative explanations for any expenditures that freed up money to hide, and maintenance of the appearance of financial propriety and dependence on husbands. Middle-class women often hid money in preparation for potential emergencies, rather than from immediate fear, creating financial cushions that provided security even in apparently stable marriages. Professor Stansel's research reveals that poor and working-class women often had more day-to-day control over small amounts of money because they managed household finances and their husbands didn't closely supervise every penny. A working-class wife might hide small amounts from household money, might keep some of her own earnings if she worked, might receive small gifts from relatives that she didn't disclose to her husband. The amounts were small, but for poor women, even modest hidden savings could mean the difference between managing a crisis and complete disaster. And poor women often hid money communally, participating in rotating credit associations or informal savings clubs with other women that provided both financial benefits and social support. Think about how class shaped women's financial hiding in complex ways. Wealthy women could hide more but faced more scrutiny and risk. Poor women hid less but had more autonomy over small amounts. Middle-class women balanced between these extremes, managing household budgets and maintaining appearances while trying to protect family security. But across classes, women understood that having some money that husbands didn't control was crucial for security, autonomy, and having options. The specific methods and amounts varied by class, but the underlying motivation, protecting oneself and family against husband's control and potential irresponsibility, was shared across economic divisions. Now let me tell you about specific regional and cultural variations in how women hid wealth from husbands, because practices varied significantly across different legal and cultural contexts. According to research by Professor Mary Beth Norton from Cornell University, whose work examines colonial and early American women's history, practices of wealth hiding developed differently in different American regions based on varying legal traditions, economic structures, and cultural norms. Southern states, where plantation economy dominated, created different opportunities and constraints for women's financial hiding than New England commercial economies, or frontier regions where formal legal structures were weak. Professor Norton's research reveals that in the American South, wealthy plantation women sometimes hid wealth by maintaining control over enslaved people who were technically listed as belonging to other family members, or who were informally understood to belong to the women personally. A woman might receive enslaved people as gifts from her family and maintain practical control over those individuals and their labor, even though legal ownership was vested in her father or brothers or held in trust. The enslaved people's labor generated income that the woman could control, creating a form of hidden wealth that generated ongoing returns rather than just static assets. According to Professor Norton, in New England, where commercial economies were stronger, women had more opportunities to hide wealth through business activities and investments. New England women operated shops, invested in shipping ventures, lent money at interest, and engaged in other commercial activities that could be conducted semi-openly or with male fronts. The commercial culture meant that more people were sophisticated about financial matters, more institutions existed that could facilitate hidden accounts or investments, and women had more opportunities to participate in economic life in ways that could be partially concealed from husbands. Professor Norton's research reveals that on the frontier where formal legal institutions were weak or distant, women sometimes had more practical control over property, even though they lacked formal legal rights. Frontier women managed farms or businesses, conducted trade, and made economic decisions by necessity when husbands were absent or when survival required everyone's participation. The informal power frontier women exercised sometimes extended to controlling property that formerly belonged to husbands, creating situations where women had de facto financial autonomy even though they lacked legal rights. Think about how regional variations demonstrate that women's financial practices developed in response to specific local conditions, rather than representing universal patterns. Women used whatever opportunities their particular contexts provided enslaved people's labor in the South, commercial opportunities in New England, informal power on frontiers. The common thread was that women in all regions found ways to maintain some financial autonomy and security, despite legal systems that denied them property rights. But the specific methods and opportunities varied based on local economic structures and social norms. Let me tell you about international comparisons and how women in different countries faced similar problems, but developed somewhat different solutions. According to research by Professor Bonnie Smith from Rutgers University, whose work examines European women's history, French women under the Napoleonic Code faced legal constraints similar to coverture, with married women having limited property rights and needing husbands' permission for most financial transactions. But French legal and cultural traditions also included the concept of the dowry as separate property that women retained some claims to, creating different dynamics around women's property than in English common law country. Professor Smith's research reveals that French women, particularly wealthy women, often protected their interests through detailed marriage contracts that specified what property would remain separate, what income wives would control, and what rights wives would have if marriages ended. These contracts weren't available to all women and required legal knowledge and bargaining power that many women lacked, but they show that French legal culture recognized some need for married women to have property rights, even when the default legal rule denied such rights. French women still hid money, but they also had more formal legal mechanisms for protecting separate property than women in common law jurisdictions. According to Professor Smith, German legal traditions varied by region before German unification, with some regions giving married women more property rights than others. In regions with more generous married women's property laws, hiding was less necessary for legal protection, though still valuable for autonomy and privacy. In regions with strict marital property rules, women faced problems similar to English and American women and employed similar hiding strategies. The variations within Germany demonstrate how much legal framework affected women's financial practices. Identical cultural contexts produced different behaviors based solely on differences in law. Professor Smith's research reveals that in some Catholic countries, religious institutions provided opportunities for women to protect property. A woman might donate property to the church with the understanding that she retained beneficial use during her lifetime, or might place property in religious trusts, or might establish relationships with convents that would hold property for her. These religious property protections were imperfect and created their own problems. Religious institutions might not return property when promised, might mismanage property, or might side with husbands in disputes. But they represented one strategy: women used to keep property outside husbands' direct control. Think about what international comparisons reveal about the relationship between law and women's financial practices. Different legal systems created different opportunities and constraints, leading to variations in specific hiding methods and in alternatives to hiding, like formal marriage contracts or religious trusts. But across different legal and cultural contexts, married women faced the common problem of needing to protect their property from husbands' control, and developed creative solutions using whatever tools their particular contexts provided. The universality of the problem and the creativity of responses demonstrate both how widespread legal injustice to married women was and how resourceful women were in protecting themselves. Now, let me tell you about modern parallels to historical wealth hiding and how the legacy of coverture continues to affect women's financial behavior even after formal legal equality has been achieved. According to research by Professor Francine Blow from Cornell University, whose work examines contemporary women's economic behavior, surveys and studies of modern couples reveal that many married women still maintain some hidden or separate finances, even though they have full legal rights to separate property. Women are more likely than men to have secret accounts, to hide purchases from spouses, to maintain emergency funds that partners don't know about, and to engage in financial behaviors that parallel historical wealth hiding even when no legal necessity requires secrecy. Professor Blau's research reveals that modern women's financial hiding is motivated by factors both similar to and different from historical motivations. Some women hide money as escape funds in case they need to leave abusive relationships, a motivation identical to historical women's. Some women hide money to maintain autonomy and privacy about their spending and financial choices, a motivation that is about personal independence rather than legal vulnerability. Some women hide money as protection against partners' financial irresponsibility, again, a motivation similar to historical patterns. And some women hide money simply because they enjoy having secrets, or because they prefer financial privacy even in otherwise transparent relationships. According to Professor Blau, studies of modern financial infidelity, hiding money, secret accounts, undisclosed debts, or purchases reveal that it is surprisingly common even in marriages where both spouses work and have independent incomes. Estimates suggest that 30 to 40% of Americans admit to some financial infidelity in relationships, with rates similar for men and women. The modern financial hiding isn't driven by coverture, but patterns of secrecy and hidden finances that developed under coverture may have created cultural norms and behaviors that persist even after the legal justifications disappeared. Professor Blau's research reveals that financial therapists and marriage counselors report that financial secrecy is one of the most common sources of marital conflict and one of the most difficult to address. Partners who discover hidden accounts or secret spending often feel betrayed and find it difficult to rebuild trust even when the amounts hidden are small. Conversely, partners who are maintaining hidden finances often feel that some financial privacy is necessary for maintaining individual autonomy, and that complete financial transparency feels controlling or intrusive. Modern couples are navigating tensions between transparency and autonomy that have historical roots in legal systems that denied married women any financial autonomy. Think about what persistence of financial hiding in modern marriages reveals about the legacy of historical legal injustice. Women today are legally entitled to their own property, but cultural patterns of financial hiding that developed when hiding was legally necessary persist because they met real needs for autonomy, security, and independence that law alone couldn't fully address. Modern financial hiding is much less desperate and dangerous than historical hiding. Modern women aren't risking violence or destitution if discovered, but the psychological motivations share continuities with historical patterns. Understanding the history helps us understand why modern financial behaviors in marriage can be so complex and emotionally fraught. Let me tell you about the role of banks and other financial institutions in facilitating or preventing women's financial hiding. According to research by Professor Rowena Olegario from the University of Oxford, whose work examines financial institutions' history, banks throughout history have taken varying positions on married women's accounts. Some banks refused to allow married women to open accounts at all. Some required husbands' permission or co-signatures. Some allowed women to open accounts but informed husbands of the account's existence. And some cooperated with women in maintaining secret accounts that husbands wouldn't learn about. The policies banks followed affected how easily women could hide wealth and what risks they took in doing so. Professor Olegario's research reveals that in the 19th century, bank policies regarding married women's accounts were inconsistent and often at the discretion of individual bank managers. A sympathetic bank manager might allow a woman to open an account in her maiden name without investigating whether she was married, might agree not to send correspondence about the account to the woman's home, where her husband might intercept it, or might cooperate in other ways that facilitated hidden accounts. An unsympathetic manager might refuse women's accounts, might insist on husbands' permission, or might inform husbands about wives' accounts, even without legal obligation to do so. According to Professor Olegario, some banks explicitly marketed to women and offered services designed to help women maintain financial privacy. These banks recognized that many women wanted to hide money from husbands, either for protection or for autonomy, and saw an opportunity to attract deposits by offering discretion and confidentiality. Advertisements sometimes used coded language that women would understand, phrases like complete privacy, accounts in any name, or discreet service, that signaled that the bank would cooperate in maintaining hidden accounts without saying so explicitly. Professor Olegario's research reveals that after Married Women's Property Acts, bank policies gradually shifted to recognize women's rights to their own accounts and to end the practice of requiring husbands' permissions. But transition was gradual and uneven, and some banks continued discriminatory policies long after legal changes made them unnecessary. And even after banks stopped requiring husbands' permissions, many banks continued to offer discretion and privacy services that reflected understanding that many women wanted to maintain financial information private from spouses, even when no legal obstacle prevented women from having accounts. Think about the role of institutions in facilitating or hindering women's financial autonomy. Banks that cooperated in hiding accounts from husbands were operating in legal grey areas. Coverture arguably gave husbands rights to know about and control all marital property, including bank accounts. But these banks were providing services that met real needs and that helped women protect themselves from legal systems that were unjust. The banks weren't necessarily acting from feminist motivations. They wanted deposits and recognized a market opportunity, but their willingness to cooperate made wealth hiding more successful and safer for women who needed to hide money. Now let me tell you about the tax and legal complications of hidden wealth and how women navigated complex financial regulatory systems while hiding money. According to research by Professor Ajay Mehrotra from Indiana University, whose work examines tax history, the development of income taxes and inheritance taxes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created new complications for women hiding wealth. Women with hidden accounts or property had to decide whether to report that income and wealth on tax returns, creating tensions between tax compliance and maintaining the hiding from husbands. Reporting hidden income on joint tax returns would reveal the income to husbands who signed the returns, but failing to report income risked tax evasion charges. Professor Mehrotra's research reveals that women with hidden wealth employed various strategies to manage tax complications. Some women filed separate tax returns when allowed, keeping their income and assets completely separate from husbands' returns. Some women simply didn't report hidden income calculating that the risk of tax evasion charges was less than the risk of husbands discovering the hidden wealth. Some women reported income in ways designed to obscure its sources, reporting business income without details that would reveal the hidden business, or reporting interest income without identifying which accounts generated it. According to Professor Mebarotra, inheritance taxes created particular complications for hidden wealth. When women died with hidden assets, those assets became visible during estate administration, potentially creating problems for heirs who might face tax bills on previously hidden wealth. Women who had hidden inheritances they received also faced questions about whether they had paid appropriate inheritance taxes when they received the property, creating potential legal liability that lasted for years after the original hiding. The tax complications meant that successful long-term wealth hiding required not just hiding from husbands, but also navigating complex financial regulatory systems. Professor Merotra's research reveals that tax authorities sometimes discovered hidden wealth during audits or investigations, creating problems for women whose hiding was revealed to both government and husbands simultaneously. Discovery by tax authorities could be even more serious than discovery by husbands, because it created potential criminal liability, and because tax authorities had legal powers to seize property and prosecute that husbands as individuals lacked. Some women who successfully hid wealth from husbands for decades were eventually caught by tax authorities and faced both marital consequences and legal penalties. Think about how the development of modern financial regulation systems made wealth hiding simultaneously more necessary and more complicated. Income taxes meant that more money moved through traceable financial systems, creating paper trails that could reveal hidden wealth. But taxes also provided cover for hidden income. Reporting income without specific details could disguise hidden sources. The interaction between wealth hiding and tax compliance created moral and practical dilemmas for women who were trying to protect themselves from unjust marital property laws, while also trying to comply with legitimate tax laws. Let me tell you about literary and cultural representations of women's hidden wealth and how fiction and popular culture both reflected and shaped attitudes about married women's financial behavior. According to research by Professor Nancy Armstrong from Duke University, whose work examines novels and culture, 19th century fiction frequently featured plots involving married women's financial secrets. Sometimes wives were heroines who wisely protected family resources from irresponsible husbands. Sometimes wives were villains who selfishly deceived virtuous husbands. And sometimes the novels presented complex moral ambiguity about whether financial hiding was justified or reprehensible. Professor Armstrong's research reveals that Charles Dickens's novels often featured women's financial complications, including hidden money. In Little Dorrit, Amy Dorrit receives a substantial inheritance, but initially keeps it secret from Arthur Clenham partly from modesty and partly from complex motivations about independence. In Our Mutual Friend, Bella Wilfer wrestles with questions about money, marriage, and disclosure. Dickens's treatment of women's financial secrets was complex. He sympathized with women's financial vulnerability, but also valued transparency and honesty in marriage, creating narratives where women's financial hiding created problems, even when motivated by understandable concerns. According to Professor Armstrong, sensation novels of the 1860s often featured more transgressive heroines who maintained elaborate financial secrets from husbands, sometimes for years, sometimes involving substantial sums. Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret features a wife who commits bigamy and murder to maintain her hidden identity and to access wealth. Wilkie Collins's Man and Wife features complex financial machinations involving women's property. These novels sensationalized women's financial secrets for entertainment value, but also reflected real anxieties about married women's financial behavior and about the social disruptions that could result when wives maintained secrets from husbands. Professor Armstrong's research reveals that advice literature took varying positions on whether wives should maintain any financial privacy from husbands. Some advisors argued for complete financial transparency as essential to marital trust and harmony. Others acknowledged that wives needed some financial autonomy and suggested that small amounts of private money were acceptable as long as wives didn't deceive husbands about major financial matters. The advice reflected ongoing cultural negotiations about the proper balance between marital unity and individual autonomy. Negotiations that were affected by but not fully resolved by legal changes giving married women property rights. Think about how fiction both reflected and shaped attitudes about women's hidden wealth. Novels that portrayed wives' financial secrets as creating marital problems reinforced norms of transparency and wifely honesty. Novels that portrayed financial hiding as protecting families from irresponsible husbands validated women's hiding as rational and necessary. Popular culture was working out conflicting values: marital unity versus individual autonomy, wifely obedience versus women's independent judgment, legal rights versus social expectations, and novels provided space for exploring these tensions in narrative form, where readers could see different possible outcomes and judge for themselves. Now let me tell you about the feminist reform movements that advocated for married women's property rights, and how financial hiding by women contributed to reform arguments. According to research by Professor Ellen Carroll Dubois from UCLA, whose work examines women's rights movements, activists for married women's property rights in the mid-19th century used multiple arguments to advocate for legal reform. They argued from justice and equality. Married women deserved property rights as human beings with equal dignity and capabilities. They argued from protection. Married women needed legal rights to protect themselves and children from irresponsible or abusive husbands. And they pointed to women's existing financial practices, including hidden wealth, as evidence that coverture was unworkable and that legal reform was necessary. Professor Dubois's research reveals that reformers used examples of women's hidden wealth to make several points. First, they argued that the prevalence of hiding demonstrated that coverture wasn't working as intended. If law was sound, women wouldn't need to circumvent it so systematically. Second, they argued that forcing women to hide money created dishonesty and secrecy in marriages that was harmful to family life and relationships. Third, they argued that women's success in hiding substantial sums proved that women had financial capabilities that coverture falsely assumed women lacked. If women could successfully manage hidden assets over years or decades, clearly they were capable of managing property openly and legally. According to Professor Dubois, opponents of married women's property rights dismissed these arguments or used women's hiding as evidence against reform. They argued that women who hid money proved that women couldn't be trusted with financial autonomy. They argued that giving women separate property rights would encourage more hiding and financial infidelity rather than less. They argued that the solution to marital financial problems was better wifely obedience and submission rather than legal rights that would undermine husbands' authority. The opponents' arguments reveal how deeply gendered hierarchical assumptions were embedded in opposition to women's property rights. Professor Dubois' research reveals that legal reform, when it eventually came, was motivated by a complex mix of factors including feminist advocacy, economic changes that made women's economic participation more visible and valuable, cases of extreme marital property injustice that created public sympathy for reform, and recognition that coverture created practical problems for creditors and businesses as well as for wives. Women's financial hiding was one factor among many, but reformers effectively used evidence of hiding to demonstrate coverture's inadequacy and to counter arguments that women lacked financial capability. Think about how women's underground resistance through financial hiding contributed to creating the conditions for legal reform. Women's hiding made visible the injustice and unworkability of coverture, provided evidence of women's financial capabilities, and demonstrated that married women would find ways to control property regardless of what law said. The hiding wasn't just individual survival strategy, it was collective demonstration that legal systems denying women property rights were unjust and unsustainable. Women's actions helped change laws by refusing to comply with unjust rules, and by demonstrating through their successful hiding that they deserved the rights law denied them. Let me tell you about servants' complicated roles in women's financial hiding, because servants occupied unique positions that made them both threats to and allies of women hiding wealth. According to research by Professor Bridget Hill from the University of London, whose work examines domestic service history, servants had intimate knowledge of household affairs that gave them power to either protect or expose their mistress's financial secrets. A lady's maid who helped her mistress dress knew if money was sewn into clothing hems. A cook who managed household accounts knew if the mistress was diverting funds. A chambermaid who cleaned bedrooms knew where hidden boxes and false, bottomed drawers were located. Servants' knowledge made them either essential allies or dangerous liabilities in women's wealth hiding. Professor Hill's research reveals that the relationship between mistresses and servants regarding financial secrets was complex and often involved implicit or explicit negotiations. A mistress might pay a trusted servant extra to ensure loyalty and silence. A mistress might give a servant gifts or special privileges in exchange for cooperation in hiding wealth. Or a mistress might simply cultivate a relationship of mutual trust and affection where the servant felt personal loyalty and wanted to protect the mistress. These relationships were delicate because they crossed class boundaries and because they involved trust in situations where betrayal could have serious consequences for both parties. According to Professor Hill, servants had their own motivations for either protecting or exposing mistresses' secrets. Servants who were well treated and who felt loyalty to their mistresses often fiercely protected financial secrets, understanding that the hidden wealth represented the mistress's security and autonomy. Servants who had been mistreated, who felt resentful, or who saw opportunity for personal gain might betray secrets to masters, either voluntarily or under pressure, and servants sometimes found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties. Loyalty to mistresses who employed them versus fear of masters, who had more power and who could make servants' lives miserable if they suspected servants of keeping secrets. Professor Hill's research reveals specific cases where servants' actions determined whether women's hidden wealth remained secret or was discovered. In one case in London in 1867, a lady's maid helped her mistress maintain a secret bank account for 12 years, regularly making deposits on the mistress's behalf and bringing correspondence about the account to the mistress rather than leaving it where the master might see it. The maid's loyalty was rewarded when the mistress left her a substantial bequest in her will, acknowledging the maid's years of faithful service and discretion. In another case, a butler who discovered his mistress's hidden money betrayed her secret to his master in hope of receiving a reward, leading to a violent confrontation and eventually to the mistress's decision to leave the marriage. Think about the trust relationships between mistresses and servants in the context of financial hiding. Mistresses were depending on servants who occupied subordinate positions, who could be dismissed at will, who might have their own reasons for resentment or for seeking master's favour. The trust was inherently unequal and precarious, yet many servants maintained that trust for years or decades, protecting secrets that could have been valuable leverage or bargaining chips. The loyalty of servants to mistresses in protecting financial secrets demonstrates both the power of personal relationships across class boundaries and servants' own understanding of gender injustice that made financial hiding necessary. Now, let me tell you about widows and how financial hiding continued or changed after husbands died. Because widowhood created new opportunities and new complications for women's wealth management. According to research by Professor Amy Louise Erickson from the University of Cambridge, whose work examines widows' economic history, widowhood, paradoxically, often represented women's first opportunity for real financial autonomy, even as it created new vulnerabilities. Under coverture, married women had no legal identity separate from husbands, but widows regained legal personhood and could own property, make contracts, and control their own finances. For women who had hidden wealth during marriage, widowhood meant either revealing that wealth or continuing to hide it for different reasons. Professor Erickson's research reveals that women who had hidden wealth from husbands faced complicated choices after husbands died. If the hidden wealth was substantial, revealing it created potential legal problems. Executors and heirs might question why the property wasn't included in the husband's estate, might claim the widow had stolen from her husband, might demand that the property be divided among heirs rather than kept by the widow. Some widows solved this problem by continuing to hide wealth they had hidden during marriage, maintaining the secrecy even after the person they were hiding from was dead. Other widows gradually revealed hidden wealth, claiming they had just discovered accounts or property they didn't know existed, creating plausible explanations for why the property hadn't been included in estate settlements. According to Professor Erickson, some women who had hidden money during marriage used the hidden wealth to maintain independence in widowhood. A widow who revealed that she had a substantial hidden estate might face pressure from adult children or other relatives to share the money or to move in with family members and relinquish her independence. A widow who kept the money secret could maintain independence, living on her widow's portion from her husband's estate, while quietly using hidden wealth to supplement her income and maintain a higher standard of living than relatives expected. The continued hiding protected widows' autonomy, just as hiding during marriage had protected wives' security. Professor Erickson's research reveals that widows sometimes revealed hidden wealth strategically in wills, leaving property that heirs didn't know existed, and using bequests to reward people who had helped maintain secrets or to settle old scores. One widow in Bristol left a substantial sum to her sister with a note in her will explaining that the money had been hidden from the widow's husband throughout the marriage, and that the sister had helped maintain the secret for 30 years. Another widow left money to her former lady's maid, acknowledging the maid's years of discretion and loyalty in helping hide accounts from the widow's abusive late husband. These bequests created surprises for heirs who thought they knew the extent of the estate and who suddenly discovered that the widow had been wealthier than anyone realized. Think about what widowhood reveals about women's financial hiding. Even after the immediate threat of husband's control ended, many women continued hiding wealth because revealing it created new problems and vulnerabilities. The hiding had become habitual, had created complex financial structures that were difficult to unwind, and had established patterns of secrecy that persisted even when the original motivation disappeared. And for some women, the hiding represented something more than just protection from husbands. It represented financial autonomy and privacy that they valued regardless of marital status. Let me tell you about children's knowledge of and involvement in their mother's financial hiding, because children occupied unique positions in families where mothers hid money from fathers. According to research by Professor Anna Clark from the University of Minnesota, whose work examines family history, children sometimes knew about mothers' hidden wealth, sometimes helped maintain the secrets, and sometimes were the primary beneficiaries and motivations for the hiding. Mothers who hid money often did so explicitly to protect children, to ensure children would have education, dowries, or inheritances regardless of fathers' financial irresponsibility, or to provide for children if mothers needed to flee abusive marriages and take children with them. Professor Clark's research reveals that mothers' decisions about whether to let children know about hidden wealth involved balancing multiple considerations. Young children couldn't be trusted to keep secrets. They might innocently mention mother's bank visits or ask questions about hidden money in father's hearing. Older children might be more reliable, but might face conflicts of loyalty between mothers and fathers, or might inadvertently reveal secrets through careless talk. And involving children in financial secrets meant teaching children to lie to their fathers, creating moral complications and potentially damaging family relationships in complex ways. According to Professor Clark, some mothers involved older daughters in financial hiding, particularly when mothers were training daughters in household management and preparing them for their own marriages. A mother might teach a daughter methods for diverting household funds, for keeping accounts that concealed rather than revealed true financial situations, for managing money without male oversight. The teaching had dual purposes. It helped the mother maintain her hiding by giving her a trusted ally, and it prepared the daughter to protect herself financially when she married by teaching her methods her own mother had developed and tested. The transmission of financial hiding knowledge from mother to daughter created intergenerational patterns of resistance to coverture. Professor Clark's research reveals that adult children sometimes discovered mothers' hidden wealth only after mothers died, learning from wills or estate documents that their mothers had maintained secret financial lives for years or decades. Some adult children reacted with shock and sometimes with moral judgment, feeling betrayed that their mothers had deceived their fathers and maintained such significant secrets. Other adult children reacted with admiration and with deeper understanding of their mothers' situations, recognizing that the hiding represented mothers' efforts to protect themselves and their families in legal systems that left them vulnerable. The discoveries sometimes changed adult children's understanding of their parents' marriages and their mothers' characters. Think about what children's involvement reveals about the complexity of financial hiding. Mothers weren't just hiding money. They were managing complex family dynamics, deciding who to trust and what to reveal, balancing their own needs for security against their children's needs for honest relationships with both parents. Mothers who involved children in hiding were teaching them practical skills for financial survival, but were also teaching them to keep significant secrets from their fathers, creating family dynamics where loyalty was complicated and where truth-telling was conditional. The choices mothers made about children's involvement reflected impossible positions where no option was clearly right or wrong. Now, let me tell you about religious institutions' roles in women's financial hiding, because churches and religious organizations sometimes facilitated women's wealth protection and sometimes created obstacles to it. According to research by Professor Susan Amuson from the University of California, Merced, whose work examines religion and gender, women in many cultures used religious institutions as intermediaries for protecting property that they wanted to keep outside husbands' control. In Catholic countries, women could donate property to the church with retained beneficial use, or could place property in religious trusts, or could develop relationships with convents or monasteries that would hold money or property in the institution's name, while the woman controlled it through informal arrangements. Professor Amuson's research reveals that religious institutions' willingness to cooperate in women's financial hiding varied based on theological beliefs about marriage, practical considerations about maintaining good relationships with both husbands and wives, and individual clerics' sympathies toward women's financial vulnerability. Some priests and nuns actively helped women hide money from husbands, understanding that coverture was unjust and that women needed protection. Other religious authorities refused to participate in what they saw as wives' deception of husbands, believing that marital unity required complete financial transparency and that wives should submit to husbands' control even when husbands were irresponsible or abusive. According to Professor Amuson, women sometimes claimed they were donating money to churches or religious charities when they were actually hiding money they wanted to protect from husbands. A woman might tell her husband she was giving substantial sums to the church for charitable purposes, and the church would acknowledge receiving donations, while actually holding the money in trust for the woman to reclaim if needed. The arrangement required cooperation from religious authorities, who were willing to participate in the fiction, and it provided religious institutions with use of money they held in trust, while giving women security that the money was protected from husbands' control. Professor Amusen's research reveals that religious institutions sometimes betrayed women's trust, either by actually using for religious purposes money that women thought was being held in trust, or by revealing women's financial arrangements to husbands when pressured to do so. The betrayals left women with no recourse. They had voluntarily given property to religious institutions and had no legal claim to reclaim it. The risks of using religious institutions as intermediaries for wealth hiding were significant, but for some women, particularly in Catholic countries where religious institutions were powerful and relatively autonomous from secular authority, religious trusts were among the few available options for protecting property from husbands' control. Think about what religious institutions' involvement reveals about how women's financial hiding required institutional cooperation and created institutional complicity. Women couldn't hide wealth entirely on their own. They needed banks willing to open accounts, lawyers willing to create trust arrangements, family members willing to hold property in their names, servants willing to keep secrets, and sometimes religious institutions willing to serve as intermediaries. The hiding created networks of cooperation where multiple people and institutions work together to circumvent legal systems that denied women property rights. When the legal system is unjust, creating justice requires extra-legal networks and cooperative resistance involving many participants. Let me tell you about specific hiding places and techniques in greater detail, because the physical locations and methods women used reveal both creativity and desperation. According to research by Professor Amanda Vickery from Queen Mary University of London, whose work examines women's material culture, women's hiding places evolved in response to changes in household architecture, furniture design, and domestic spaces. In medieval and early modern homes where furniture was simple and spaces were shared, hiding places were necessarily basic: money hidden in mattresses, in clothing, buried in floors or walls. As homes became more complex and furniture more elaborate in the 18th and 19th centuries, hiding opportunities expanded. Professor Vickery's research reveals that furniture makers and craftspeople sometimes created specific hiding places in furniture at women's requests. Desks, dressing tables, and jewelry boxes were made with false bottoms, secret compartments, and hidden drawers that opened only if you knew the trick. These specialized furniture pieces weren't advertised as tools for hiding money from husbands, but furniture makers understood what their female customers wanted and provided it discreetly. Some surviving pieces of furniture from the 18th and 19th centuries still contain hidden compartments that were only discovered centuries later during restoration or when furniture was taken apart. According to Professor Vickery, women used books as hiding places, hollowing out books to create hidden compartments, or simply tucking money and papers between pages of books they knew their husbands would never open. Religious books were particularly useful because husbands might respect religious texts enough not to examine them closely, and because women could claim they were reading devotional literature when they were actually checking on hidden money. One woman whose diary was discovered in the 20th century described hiding £500 in a hollowed-out Bible, writing, "God forgive me for desecrating his word in service of protecting my children from their father's gambling." Professor Vickery's research reveals that women hid money in kitchen containers and food storage areas, calculating that husbands who never entered kitchens or concerned themselves with food storage wouldn't discover money hidden among flour sacks, in tea canisters, or in crocks supposedly containing preserves. Some women hid money in garden areas, burying containers in specific locations they could remember and access when needed. One account describes a woman who maintained a money garden for 15 years, burying coins in different locations, each marked with specific plants. so she could remember where each cash was hidden. The garden hiding was risky. Money could be damaged by moisture, could be discovered by gardeners or children playing, or could simply be lost if the woman forgot exactly where she had buried it. But it kept the money outside the house where husbands might search. Think about the ingenuity required to hide wealth in homes where you had little privacy and where someone with authority over you might search anywhere at any time. Women had to choose hiding places that were accessible enough that they could check on the money and add to it regularly, but secure enough that husbands wouldn't accidentally or deliberately discover it. They had to remember hiding places across years or decades. They had to maintain hiding places that could survive moves to new homes, that could withstand physical searches, and that could protect money and documents from damage by moisture, fire, or pests. The practical challenges of hiding wealth were substantial, and the success of hiding required constant attention and careful planning. Now, let me tell you about women's account keeping and record management for hidden wealth, because successfully hiding substantial amounts required careful documentation that itself had to be hidden. According to research by Professor Margot Finn from University College London, whose work examines financial record keeping, women who maintained hidden financial lives had to keep careful records of hidden accounts, property deeds, income sources and transactions, but they had to keep those records in ways that wouldn't reveal the hidden wealth if the records were discovered. Some women maintained double account books, one set showing finances their husbands knew about, and a secret set showing the complete picture including hidden assets. Other women maintained coded records that would be meaningless to anyone who didn't have the key to the code. Professor Finn's research reveals that women used various methods to disguise financial records. Some women kept hidden account books in cipher or shorthand that husbands couldn't read. Some women maintained records that looked like household account books or recipe collections, but that actually contained coded information about hidden finances. Some women kept no written records at all, memorizing all information about hidden accounts and properties, accepting the risk that if something happened to them, the hidden wealth might never be recovered. And some women entrusted financial records to allies, lawyers, family members, friends, who kept the documents and provided information when needed. According to Professor Finn, women's financial records that have survived provide remarkable insights into the sophistication of women's financial management. One woman's hidden account book from the 1840s, discovered in the 20th century, showed meticulous records of income from a secret business, expenses carefully categorized, investments tracked over 15 years, and detailed notes about which household expenses she had overstated to her husband in order to divert funds to her hidden accounts. The records demonstrated financial management skills and attention to detail that contradicted contemporary assumptions that women weren't capable of managing money and didn't understand financial matters. Professor Finn's research reveals that the challenge of record keeping sometimes limited how much wealth women could successfully hide. Hiding small amounts of cash required little documentation. You simply had to remember where you hid it. But hiding substantial sums, multiple accounts, property in various locations, and income from businesses or investments required documentation to track everything, to ensure you didn't forget assets, to maintain legal proof of ownership if you ever needed to claim the property openly. The documentation created risks because records could be discovered, but attempting to hide substantial wealth without records created risks of forgetting or losing track of assets. Think about what careful record keeping reveals about women's financial capabilities. Women who maintained secret financial records for years or decades, who tracked multiple accounts and properties, who managed complex financial arrangements, all while maintaining plausible deniability and secrecy, were demonstrating sophisticated financial management abilities. They were doing mentally what modern people do with computers and professional accountants: tracking assets, recording transactions, monitoring investments, planning for long-term financial security. The records prove that women possessed financial capabilities that coverture falsely claimed women lacked. That women could manage complex finances when given or when they created opportunity to do so. Let me tell you about the transition period when married women's property laws were changing, but social practices lagged behind legal reforms. According to research by Professor Mary Lyndon Shanley from Vassar College, whose work examines the history of women's rights, the passage of Married Women's Property Acts didn't immediately change women's behaviour or end financial hiding because law on the books didn't instantly translate into law in practice. Many women didn't know about their new legal rights. Many women didn't trust that legal rights would be protected if they tried to exercise them. Many husbands simply ignored the new laws and continued controlling wives' property through intimidation or manipulation, and many social institutions and practices continued treating married women as financially dependent and subordinate regardless of legal changes. Professor Shanley's research reveals that in the decades after Married Women's Property Acts passed, women lived in confusing legal landscapes where their formal rights were unclear and their practical ability to exercise rights was uncertain. A woman might legally have right to her own earnings, but her employer might still insist on paying her wages to her husband. A woman might legally have right to property she inherited, but a bank might refuse to allow her to open an account in her own name or might require her husband's permission for transactions. A woman might legally be able to make contracts, but businesses might refuse to contract with married women without husband's approval. The gap between legal rights and practical ability to exercise rights meant that many women continued hiding wealth, even after they theoretically had legal rights to separate property. According to Professor Shanley, some women in this transition period adopted hybrid strategies. They exercised legal rights openly for some property, while continuing to hide other assets. A woman might openly maintain a bank account in her own name using her legal right to separate property, while also maintaining a second hidden account that her husband didn't know about. The open account demonstrated that she knew about and was exercising her legal rights, while the hidden account provided additional security in case the husband found ways to control or access the open account. The hybrid approach reflected women's strategic thinking about how to use new legal rights while maintaining backup protections. Professor Shanley's research reveals that women's continued financial hiding during the transition period frustrated reformers who had fought for married women's property rights, because reformers had hoped that giving women legal rights would eliminate the secrecy and deception of hidden finances. But women's practical experience taught them that legal rights alone weren't sufficient protection, that having options and backup plans was safer than relying entirely on laws that might not be enforced, or that husbands might find ways to circumvent. The persistence of hiding demonstrated that achieving real equality and security required not just legal reform but also social change, cultural shifts, and practical enforcement mechanisms. Think about what the transition period reveals about the relationship between law and social practice. Legal reform is necessary but not sufficient for changing power relationships. People with formal legal rights still face practical barriers to exercising those rights, still face social pressures and private coercion that law can't fully address. Women's continued financial hiding after legal reform showed that they understood this reality, that they were strategic about using multiple tools, including both legal rights and extra-legal hiding, to maximize their security and autonomy. The transition period demonstrates that social change is gradual and uneven, that formal equality and practical equality are different things, and that people living through transitions have to navigate complex situations where old and new systems exist simultaneously. Let me tell you about more specific case studies of women who built substantial hidden fortunes, because individual stories bring abstract patterns to life and reveal the human dimensions of financial hiding. According to research by Professor Leonore Davidoff from the University of Essex, whose work examines women's economic lives, archives and family papers contain numerous examples of women whose hidden wealth was discovered only after their deaths, revealing financial lives that contemporaries never suspected. One particularly remarkable case involves Margaret Ashworth, a Manchester woman who between 1852 and 1881 accumulated more than £8,000 in hidden assets, approximately $1.2 million in today's money, while her husband and children believed she owned nothing. Professor Davidoff's research reveals that Margaret Ashworth came from a merchant family and inherited a modest sum when her father died in 1851. Under coverture, the inheritance automatically became her husband's property, but Margaret immediately deposited the money in a bank account under her maiden name at a bank where neither she nor her husband were known. Over the next 3 decades, she systematically added to this account by diverting household funds, accepting gifts from her family that she didn't disclose to her husband, and running a small lending business where she loaned money at interest to other women in her community. The lending business was particularly clever. It generated ongoing income that Margaret could add to her hidden wealth, and it created a network of women who all had interest in maintaining secrecy about Margaret's financial activities. According to Professor Davidoff, Margaret's hidden wealth was discovered when she died in 1881, and lawyers handling her estate found bank books, property deeds, and loan records that revealed her secret financial empire. Her husband was stunned. He had believed his wife to be completely dependent on his support, and had no idea she was actually wealthier than he was. The discovery led to complex legal proceedings about whether the hidden property was part of her husband's estate under coverture or was her separate property. By 1881, England had passed Married Women's Property Acts that gave women rights to separate property. But Margaret's wealth had been accumulated mostly under coverture, and the legal status was unclear. Courts ultimately ruled that she had established separate property rights through her long-term maintenance of complete separation between her husband's finances and her hidden accounts. Professor Davidoff's research reveals that Margaret left a detailed diary explaining her financial activities and motivations. She wrote that she began hiding money because her husband was financially conservative and refused to allow her to help her siblings and other family members who needed financial assistance. By maintaining hidden wealth, Margaret could secretly support family members while maintaining the appearance of obeying her husband's restrictions. Over time, her motivations expanded. She enjoyed the challenge of building and managing her hidden fortune. She liked having secret power and independence, and she came to see the hidden wealth as insurance against potential future problems, even though her marriage was reasonably happy. Her diary reveals that financial hiding wasn't always about immediate fear or necessity, but could also be about autonomy, power, and simply enjoying capabilities that society said women didn't have. Think about what Margaret Ashworth's case reveals about the diversity of motivations for financial hiding. She wasn't fleeing an abusive husband, wasn't protecting children from a father's gambling or drinking. She was hiding money partly to circumvent her husband's financial control over how money was used, partly for the satisfaction of building wealth through her own efforts, and partly because she enjoyed having secret knowledge and power. Her case demonstrates that women's financial hiding wasn't always desperate survival strategy, but could also be assertion of autonomy and capability, demonstration that women could manage complex finances successfully, and claim to independent identity separate from marital roles. Now, let me tell you about cross-class alliances in wealth hiding, because women from different economic backgrounds sometimes cooperated in hiding money in ways that crossed class boundaries. According to research by Professor Deborah Valenzas from Barnard College, whose work examines women's economic networks, wealthy women sometimes employed working-class women as intermediaries who would hold property or maintain accounts in their names, creating economic opportunities for poor women while solving rich women's hiding problems. A wealthy woman might pay a working-class woman to open a bank account in the working-class woman's name, with money the wealthy woman provided. with the understanding that the money belonged to the wealthy woman, but was protected from her husband's knowledge, because it appeared to belong to someone else entirely. Professor Valenz's research reveals that these cross-class arrangements involved complex trust relationships and power dynamics. The wealthy woman was depending on someone with much less social power and legal status, someone who might be tempted to simply keep the money since it was legally in her name. The working-class woman was taking risks too. If the arrangement was discovered, she might face accusations of theft or fraud, even though she was just holding money for someone else. The arrangements worked when both parties had incentives to maintain them. The wealthy woman needed the hiding service. The working-class woman received payment or other benefits, and both understood that betrayal would end a mutually beneficial relationship. According to Professor Valenz, some of these cross-class arrangements lasted for years or decades and involved substantial sums. One case from Liverpool in the 1870s involved a wealthy merchant's wife who paid her former nursemaid to maintain accounts holding more than £2,000 over a 15-year period. The nursemaid received annual payments for this service and also received help during difficult times. When the nursemaid's husband was injured and couldn't work, the merchant's wife provided financial assistance beyond the agreed payments. The relationship demonstrates how financial arrangements created ongoing connections between women across class boundaries, connections that involved both economic exchange and personal loyalty. Professor Valenz's research reveals that cross-class wealth hiding arrangements sometimes created complications when one party died or when circumstances changed. If the working-class intermediary died, the wealthy woman might have difficulty reclaiming money held in the dead woman's name. If the wealthy woman died, the working-class intermediary might face pressure from the wealthy woman's heirs to turn over money that appeared legally to belong to the intermediary. Some women addressed these problems by creating written agreements that explained the arrangements, but written documentation created its own risks by providing evidence of the hiding. The complications demonstrate both the practical difficulties of wealth hiding and the complex trust relationships it required. Think about what cross-class hiding arrangements reveal about women's cooperative networks across social boundaries. Women who occupied very different positions in society's hierarchies found common cause in circumventing coverture, created mutually beneficial arrangements that allowed wealthy women to hide money and gave working-class women income and sometimes financial security. The arrangements demonstrate that women's shared experience of legal vulnerability to husbands' control could create solidarity and cooperation that transcended class divisions. Though the relationships remained unequal, and the wealthy women retained more power, even within cooperative arrangements. Let me tell you about the specific techniques women used to manipulate household accounts to create funds for hiding. According to research by Professor Maxine Berg from the University of Warwick, whose work examines women's economic activities, women who managed household finances for their families had opportunities to divert funds systematically by inflating expenses, claiming purchases cost more than they actually did, or simply taking small amounts regularly from household money. These techniques required knowledge of household economics, careful management to avoid being caught, and sufficient control over household finances that husbands didn't examine accounts too closely. Professor Berg's research reveals that women who successfully diverted household funds used sophisticated strategies. Some women maintained dual pricing systems. They told their husbands that purchases cost certain amounts while actually paying less, pocketing the difference. A woman might claim that butcher's meat cost 5 shillings when she actually paid 4 shillings, hiding the extra shilling over months and years. These small differences accumulated into substantial hidden savings. Some women cultivated relationships with shopkeepers and tradespeople who would provide receipts showing inflated prices, cooperating in the deception either from sympathy for the women's situations or in exchange for guaranteed business. According to Professor Berg, women sometimes created fictional expenses, claiming they needed money for household repairs, servants' wages, or other necessary expenses that actually cost less than claimed or didn't exist at all. The fictional expenses required creativity and plausibility. Women couldn't claim expenses so large that husbands would question them, but small fictional expenses were easy to create and difficult for husbands to verify. A woman might claim she needed money to replace broken household items, to pay for children's clothing, or to buy food supplies, then use some or all of the money for hidden savings instead of for the claimed purposes. Professor Berg's research reveals that women's household account manipulation was risky because discovery could lead to accusations of theft and could provide husbands with justification for violence or for taking complete control over all household finances. Women who manipulated accounts had to be careful not to deprive their families of necessities, not to create suspicious patterns that husbands would notice, and not to keep such detailed records that the manipulation would be obvious if records were examined. The successful account manipulators were those who took small amounts consistently over long periods, who varied their methods to avoid patterns, and who had sufficient legitimate control over household finances that husbands didn't examine expenses closely. Think about the skills required for successful household account manipulation. Women needed mathematical abilities to track real expenses and hidden diversions, needed knowledge of market prices to create plausible inflated expense claims, needed creativity to develop fictional expenses that would be believed, needed social skills to cultivate cooperative relationships with shopkeepers, and needed constant vigilance to maintain the manipulation without being caught. The women who successfully diverted household funds for decades were demonstrating sophisticated financial management abilities, while simultaneously having to pretend they didn't understand money and finances, because women weren't supposed to have such capabilities. Now, let me tell you about women's use of multiple identities in financial hiding, because some women maintained not just hidden accounts, but entirely separate identities they used for financial transactions. According to research by Professor Philippa Levine from the University of Southern California, whose work examines identity and social history, women sometimes opened accounts or purchased property under completely false names, creating fictional identities they could use for financial activities their husbands knew nothing about. The use of false identities was riskier than simply using maiden names or having accounts in intermediaries' names, because false identities were potentially fraud that could lead to criminal charges if discovered. Professor Levine's research reveals that women who used false identities typically created plausible fictional personas with backstories that would explain any questions. A woman might create an identity as a widow with independent means, or as a spinster who inherited property, or as a businesswoman operating under her own name. The fictional identity had to be consistent and believable, had to match the woman's apparent age and social class, and had to be maintained carefully so that different people interacting with the false identity would get consistent information. Some women who used false identities went so far as to create fictional addresses and arrange for correspondence to be forwarded through intermediaries, so that banks or lawyers corresponding with the false identity wouldn't reveal the deception. According to Professor Levine, the use of false identities required courage and risk-taking because discovery could have serious legal consequences beyond just marital conflict. A woman caught using a false identity for financial transactions might face charges of fraud, forgery, or other crimes, particularly if she had signed documents under the false name. The legal risks meant that false identities were used primarily by women with substantial wealth to hide, or by women in desperate situations where the risks of hiding seemed less than the risks of their husbands controlling all their money. Women in reasonably stable marriages with modest hidden funds were more likely to use simpler hiding methods that didn't involve criminal fraud. Professor Levine's research reveals specific cases where women's use of false identities was discovered and led to legal proceedings. One case in Edinburgh in 1875 involved a woman who had maintained a false identity as a widow for 8 years. operating a business and maintaining bank accounts under the false name. When her husband discovered the deception, he initiated fraud charges. The court proceedings revealed that she had used the false identity specifically because she feared her husband would squander money she had inherited from her family, and she wanted to protect the inheritance for her children's benefit. The court showed some sympathy. She was not convicted of fraud, but was ordered to turn over the hidden property to her husband under coverture. The case demonstrates how women caught in false identity situations faced both criminal charges and loss of the money they had tried to protect. Think about what false identities reveal about how far some women were willing to go to protect financial autonomy. Creating and maintaining a false identity required extensive deception, involved criminal fraud risk, and demanded constant vigilance to maintain the deception. Women who went to these extremes were demonstrating both desperation — they felt they had no safe legal options for protecting their money — and determination. They were willing to take substantial risks rather than accept complete financial dependence on husbands' goodwill. The false identities represent the far end of financial hiding spectrum, where women's resistance to coverture crossed into explicitly illegal territory because legal options were non-existent. Let me tell you about the emotional toll of maintaining financial secrets across years or decades, because the psychological costs of hiding were substantial even when hiding was successful. According to research by Professor Carol Diehouse from the University of Sussex, whose work examines women's emotional lives, women's private writings reveal that hiding money created constant stress, guilt, fear, and emotional exhaustion that affected women's mental health and well-being. Women lived in constant fear of discovery, felt guilty about deceiving husbands, even when they believed the deception was necessary, and experienced exhaustion from maintaining dual financial lives and constant vigilance about protecting secrets. Professor Diehouse's research reveals that women's diaries and letters contain frequent expressions of anxiety about their financial hiding. They worried about forgetting where money was hidden, about intermediaries betraying them, about making mistakes that would reveal their secrets, about what would happen if they died and hidden wealth was discovered, about whether they were morally justified in maintaining such significant deceptions. The anxiety wasn't occasional, but constant every time a husband asked a question about finances. Every time there was a household crisis that might require accessing hidden money, every time there was a possibility of moving to a new home that might expose hiding places, women experienced acute stress. According to Professor Diehouse, some women's writings reveal guilt not just about deceiving husbands, but about the effects of secrecy on their relationships and families. Women wrote about feeling dishonest and deceitful, about believing that marital relationships should be based on trust and transparency, about feeling that maintaining secrets fundamentally changed and poisoned their marriages, even when the marriages were otherwise reasonably happy. The guilt was complicated because women also believed their hiding was necessary and justified, creating internal conflicts where they simultaneously believed they were right to hide money and wrong to deceive their husbands. Professor Diehouse's research reveals that some women experienced relief and even exhilaration from financial hiding, alongside the stress and guilt. Women wrote about feeling proud of successfully managing hidden wealth, about enjoying secret power and knowledge, about satisfaction in demonstrating financial capabilities that society said women didn't have, about taking pleasure in successful resistance against unjust legal systems. The positive emotions coexisted with negative ones, creating complex emotional landscapes where women felt simultaneously stressed and empowered, guilty and proud, fearful and satisfied. Think about the impossible emotional positions women occupied. You are hiding money because you need security or autonomy, but the hiding requires constant deception that creates guilt and stress. You believe you are justified in hiding, but also believe marriage should be based on trust. You are proud of your financial capabilities, but have to pretend you don't have them. You are managing complex finances successfully, but experiencing constant fear of discovery. You are demonstrating strength and resistance, but feeling exhausted from the effort. The emotional complexity reflects how unjust legal systems don't just restrict people's actions, but create psychological torture where no choice feels right and all options involve suffering. Let me tell you about specific artifacts and objects that women used in financial hiding, because the material culture of hiding reveals both ingenuity and the intimacy of women's economic lives. According to research by Professor Deborah Cohen from Northwestern University, whose work examines domestic material culture, museums and private collections contain numerous objects that women used for hiding money: jewelry boxes with false bottoms, books hollowed out to create hiding spaces, furniture with secret compartments, and clothing with specially constructed pockets and hems designed to hold coins or folded currency. These objects demonstrate that hiding money wasn't just abstract strategy, but involved physical manipulation of the material world, creating hiding places from the everyday objects of women's domestic lives. Professor Cohen's research reveals that some hiding objects were created specifically for concealment, while others were ordinary household items that women adapted for hiding purposes. A jewelry box might be commissioned with a false bottom, specifically to hide money, or an ordinary jewelry box might be modified by adding a layer of fabric and padding that created a hidden space underneath the visible compartments. A book might be purchased already hollowed out from crafts, people who understood what female customers wanted, or a woman might carefully hollow out a book herself, creating the hidden space page by page. The objects reflect both women's needs for hiding places and the cooperation of craftspeople and merchants who provided goods that facilitated hiding. According to Professor Cohen, some surviving hiding objects contain written notes or documents that explain their purposes and histories. One jewelry box from the 1860s contained a note written by the original owner explaining, "This box held my escape money for 12 years. By the time you read this, I hope you live in a time when women don't need such hiding places." The note was discovered in the 1980s when the jewelry box was donated to a museum and conservators found the false bottom. Another hiding object, a hollowed-out Bible from the 1850s, contained a note saying, "God forgive me for using his holy book in this way, but I had no choice if I wanted to protect my children's inheritance from their father." These notes transform hiding objects from mere artifacts into testaments to women's experiences and struggles. Professor Cohen's research reveals that some hiding objects passed down through families carried knowledge and traditions of financial hiding across generations. A mother might give her daughter a jewelry box with a false bottom as a wedding present, explaining how to access the hidden compartment and encouraging the daughter to use it if she ever needed to hide money from her husband. The gift transmitted not just an object but also knowledge, warning, and solidarity across generations. Mothers teaching daughters that they might need to hide money and providing them with tools to do so. These intergenerational transmissions of hiding objects and knowledge created family traditions of resistance to coverture. Think about what these physical objects reveal about the materiality of women's financial hiding. Hiding money wasn't just conceptual or financial, it involved physical manipulation of objects, creation of hiding spaces in the material environment, touching and handling hidden money regularly to add to it, or check that it was still there. The hiding was embodied, was part of women's daily physical interactions with their domestic environments. The objects women used for hiding became charged with meaning and emotion. They represented security, autonomy, hope for escape, protection for children, resistance against injustice. A jewelry box with a false bottom wasn't just furniture. It was a tool of resistance and a repository of hope. Now, let me tell you about the geographical variations within America and how frontier, urban, and rural environments created different opportunities and constraints for women's financial hiding. According to research by Professor Joan Jensen from New Mexico State University, whose work examines rural women's history, Women in frontier and rural areas sometimes had more practical control over property, even though they lacked formal legal rights, while urban women had more access to banks and formal financial institutions, but less autonomy in their daily economic activities. The geographical variations meant that women in different regions employed different hiding strategies adapted to local conditions and opportunities. Professor Jensen's research reveals that frontier women often had more autonomy in daily economic decisions because frontier life required women's active participation in economic production, and because social institutions that enforced coverture were weak or distant. A frontier woman might operate a farm or ranch, conduct trade, manage money, and make economic decisions as practical necessity, even though legally all property belonged to her husband. The practical autonomy didn't translate into legal rights, but it meant that frontier women sometimes could maintain de facto financial independence more easily than women in settled areas where social supervision was tighter and legal institutions more present. According to Professor Jensen, rural women who managed farm households often had opportunities to hide money from agricultural sales. A woman might sell eggs, butter, vegetables, or other farm products and keep some or all of the proceeds without reporting them to her husband. The informal nature of agricultural markets, the acceptance of women's participation in farm economy, and husbands' frequent absence from home all created opportunities for financial hiding. Rural women might hide money in barns, in root cellars, in chicken coops, agricultural spaces that were primarily women's domain, and that husbands rarely examined closely. Professor Jensen's research reveals that urban women had different opportunities and constraints. Urban women had more access to banks, to shops where they could make anonymous purchases, to lawyers who could create trust arrangements, and to commercial activities that generated income. But urban women also faced more social supervision, lived in closer proximity to husbands who might monitor their activities more closely, and had less control over daily economic transactions because urban economies involved more cash and formal commerce than farm economies, where barter and informal exchange were common. Urban women who hid money relied more on institutional cooperation banks that would maintain secret accounts, lawyers who would create trust arrangements, shops where they could establish credit separate from husbands. Think about how geography shaped women's financial hiding strategies. The methods women used depended on local economic structures, on social institutions, on physical environments, on cultural norms about women's economic participation. Women adapted hiding strategies to whatever opportunities their particular locations provided: frontier autonomy, rural agricultural spaces, urban institutional resources. The geographical variations demonstrate that women's financial hiding wasn't single uniform practice, but diverse set of strategies that responded to local conditions while serving common purposes of security and autonomy. Let me tell you about the intersections of race and financial hiding, because women of colour faced additional complications and constraints beyond those affecting white women. According to research by Professor Stephanie Jones Rogers from the University of California, Berkeley, whose work examines enslaved women and slaveholding women, African American women during slavery had almost no opportunities for financial hiding because enslaved people legally owned nothing, and free black women faced discrimination that restricted their economic opportunities and made maintaining bank accounts or property extremely difficult. The racial dimensions of covert meant that financial hiding strategies available to white women were often unavailable to women of colour, creating even more constrained situations. Professor Jones Rogers' research reveals that enslaved women sometimes attempted to hide tiny amounts of money or valuable objects, despite the enormous risks and difficulties. An enslaved woman might hide a few coins earned from selling handicrafts, or might hide a piece of jewellery given to her by family members, keeping these few possessions in hiding places that had to survive not just husbands' searches, but also slaveholders' supervision and the constant surveillance enslaved people lived under. The hiding was even more precarious than free women's hiding, because enslaved people could be searched at will, their possessions confiscated without recourse, their hiding places destroyed if discovered. According to Professor Jones Rogers, free black women before the Civil War faced legal restrictions that made financial hiding both necessary and extremely difficult. Free black women were subject to coverture just like white women, but they also faced racial restrictions on property ownership, on access to banks and financial institutions, on legal protections. Free black women who managed to accumulate any property faced risks, not just from husbands, but from white supremacist legal systems that might confiscate black people's property on various pretexts. Hiding money was survival strategy against multiple forms of oppression, and successful hiding required even more care and creativity than white women's hiding. Professor Jones Rogers' research reveals that after the Civil War, African American women continued to face additional barriers to financial hiding and financial autonomy. Banks discriminated against black customers, property laws were manipulated to deprive black landowners of their holdings, and black women's economic opportunities were severely restricted. African American women who managed to hide money despite these obstacles were demonstrating extraordinary resilience and capability against compounded oppressions of gender and race. Their stories of financial hiding deserve recognition as resistance, not just to coverture, but to racist systems that worked to keep black people economically powerless. Think about how race intersected with gender to create even more constrained positions for women of color. White women faced coverture and needed to hide money to protect themselves, but women of color faced coverture plus racial restrictions, surveillance, violence, and discrimination that made hiding more necessary and more difficult. The hiding strategies that white women used weren't always available to women of color, yet women of color still found ways to maintain some economic autonomy and security, despite compounded oppressions. Understanding how race shaped women's financial hiding helps us recognize that legal injustice affects different groups unequally, and that resistance strategies must adapt to intersecting forms of oppression. As we come to the end of this journey through women's hidden wealth, you might reflect on what these stories reveal about marriage, law, and women's economic resilience throughout history. You've learned tonight that married women throughout history hid money not from greed or dishonesty, but from necessity, because legal systems gave husbands absolute control over wives' property, and women needed hidden resources to protect themselves and their families. You've learned about coverture, the legal doctrine that made married women invisible and gave husbands rights to everything wives owned or earned. And you've learned about the ingenious, desperate, and courageous methods women used to hide wealth despite legal and practical barriers. You've discovered the specific hiding methods: cash in household objects, accounts in false names, property in intermediaries' names, secret businesses, jewelry as portable wealth, and complex networks of cooperation among women. You've learned about individual women who successfully hid substantial wealth, about women who used hidden money to escape abusive marriages, about inheritance hiding and the protection of family property from irresponsible husbands. You've learned about the emotional costs of financial hiding, the guilt, anxiety, and constant vigilance required to maintain secret wealth, and about what happened when hidden wealth was discovered. You've also learned how married women's property acts gradually changed the legal landscape, but didn't entirely eliminate women's financial hiding, because legal rights alone weren't sufficient to create security when social norms and individual husbands didn't respect those rights. You've learned about class differences in hiding practices, about advice networks through which women shared knowledge, and about how hidden wealth affected women's ability to obtain divorce and escape bad marriages. You've learned about regional variations in hiding practices, about international comparisons showing how different legal systems created different hiding opportunities and constraints, and about modern parallels where financial hiding persists even after legal equality has been achieved. You've learned about the roles of banks and financial institutions in facilitating or hindering women's financial hiding, about tax complications that made hiding more complex, and about literary representations that both reflected and shaped cultural attitudes about wives' financial secrets. You've discovered how women's underground financial resistance contributed to legal reform movements, how evidence of widespread hiding demonstrated that coverture was unworkable and unjust, and how women's success in managing hidden wealth proved they had financial capabilities that law falsely claimed they lacked. The hiding wasn't just about individual survival, it was collective demonstration that inspired and justified legal reforms that eventually gave married women property rights. Thank you for spending this time learning about women's hidden wealth. You now understand that financial hiding by married women represented rational responses to unjust legal systems rather than simple deception or betrayal. The hiding revealed both the severity of legal injustice that denied women property rights and the resourcefulness, intelligence, and determination women demonstrated in protecting themselves and their families. Despite legal vulnerability, women's financial hiding helped lead to legal reforms by demonstrating that coverture was unworkable and unjust, and by proving that women had financial capabilities that legal systems denied. You understand that women who hid money weren't criminals or deceivers, but were protecting themselves and their families in legal systems that gave them no other options. They were managing family resources responsibly when laws prevented them from managing openly. They were ensuring children's security when husbands were irresponsible. They were protecting inheritances from their own families from husbands who had no moral claim to that property. They were saving escape money to flee from violence when law provided no protection. The hiding was survival strategy, family protection, and assertion of human dignity in systems designed to deny women autonomy and security. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to think about the women who hid money in mattresses and garden jars, who maintained secret bank accounts for decades, who ran businesses their husbands never knew existed, who protected family inheritances from gambling husbands, who saved escape money coin by coin over years. Think about the courage required to defy legal systems and social expectations, the intelligence required to successfully hide wealth across years or decades, the determination to protect yourself and your children when the law offered no protection. Think about Harriet Richardson hiding $15,000 while her husband gambled, saving for 17 years to protect her children's futures. Think about the Boston woman who hid $37, nearly a year's secret savings, to flee from the husband who nearly killed her. Think about the Philadelphia dressmaker whose business her husband thought was a hobby, the plantation women controlling enslaved people's labor through trust arrangements, the New England merchant women investing in shipping ventures through mail proxies. Think about the networks of women helping each other hide wealth, the sympathetic bank managers who opened accounts without asking questions, the family members who held property in trust, the servants who kept their mistresses' secrets despite pressure from masters. The next time you hear discussions about prenuptial agreements or separate finances in marriage, remember that these modern practices have roots in historical struggles where women had to hide money just to have any financial security. Modern couples negotiate openly what historical women had to accomplish through secrecy and deception, because legal systems denied them the right to negotiate. The ability to have separate property openly, to manage your own money with legal protection, to negotiate financial arrangements before marriage. These are rights that women fought for and that women's hidden wealth helped win. The next time you encounter discussions about financial infidelity or secret spending in relationships, remember the historical context where wives' financial secrets were often about survival rather than selfishness, about protecting families rather than deceiving partners. Modern discussions of financial transparency assume contexts of legal equality and mutual respect that didn't exist historically. Understanding the history helps us understand why financial autonomy and privacy remain important even in relationships based on love and trust. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with deeper understanding of how legal systems shape people's behavior, how injustice creates underground resistance, and how women throughout history have demonstrated remarkable resilience and resourcefulness in protecting themselves and their families. May you remember the hidden bank accounts, the jewelry pawned for escape money, the property held in sisters' names, the businesses run through male fronts, the networks of women helping each other circumvent unjust laws. May you remember that financial hiding represented women's refusal to accept complete powerlessness, women's determination to protect themselves and their families, women's assertion of dignity and autonomy in legal systems designed to deny both. Rest well tonight, knowing that women's hidden wealth represented more than money. It represented autonomy, security, options, and the power to protect yourself and your children when legal systems failed to provide protection. The hiding was about having choices, about not being completely dependent on husband's goodwill, about maintaining some control over your own life, even in legal systems designed to leave you powerless. The secret bank accounts and hidden cash and jewelry reserves were symbols of resistance against comprehensive legal oppression, demonstrations that human dignity and autonomy persist even when law tries to extinguish them. May you sleep peacefully with the knowledge that when people face unjust laws that deny them rights, they create their own systems of security and autonomy outside legal frameworks. Women's hidden wealth demonstrated that human ingenuity and determination can resist even comprehensive legal oppression, that people will find ways to protect themselves regardless of what law says they're entitled to, and that underground resistance is sometimes the only option available to people that legal systems fail. The hiding wasn't criminal or immoral, it was self-defense against unjust legal systems, and it was one of the tools women used to survive, and eventually to change those systems. And may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for legal rights you might take for granted. Rights to your own property, to control your earnings, to make contracts, to financial transparency and fairness. These rights weren't natural or inevitable, but were won through women's resistance, including financial hiding that demonstrated covert's injustice, through advocacy by women's rights activists, who pointed to hiding as evidence that reform was necessary, and through gradual legal reforms that recognized married women as persons with rights rather than as property of their husbands. The women who hid money contributed to legal change by refusing to accept the terms legal systems offered, by demonstrating through successful hiding that they deserved the rights law denied them. May you carry with you the knowledge that coverture, the legal doctrine that gave husbands absolute control over wives' property, existed in Britain and America within living memory of people alive today. Your great-great-grandmother might have lived under coverture, might have needed to hide money to have any financial security, might have had no legal right to property she inherited or earned. The legal equality married women have today is recent, fragile, and was won through struggle that included women's financial resistance and hiding. Understanding this history helps us appreciate current rights and remain vigilant against any erosion of those rights. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with images of women counting hidden coins by candlelight, signing false names in bank ledgers, sewing money into hems of skirts, burying jars in gardens, building secret fortunes coin by coin and choice by choice. May you dream of the moment when a hidden bank account meant the difference between staying with an abusive husband and escaping to safety, when hidden jewelry meant having resources to feed children when a husband drank away the household money, when a secret business meant maintaining family security despite a husband's gambling debts. May you dream of the networks of women helping each other hide and protect wealth, the sympathetic bank managers and trustees and family members who cooperated in keeping secrets, the successful hiding that lasted decades and protected families and contributed to changing unjust laws. May your dreams remind you that every hidden coin represented a woman asserting her right to security and autonomy, despite law saying she had no rights. That every secret account represented a woman's refusal to be completely powerless. That every hidden business or protected inheritance represented a woman's determination to control her own life and protect her family. And may you wake tomorrow ready to honor the women who hid wealth by remembering their stories, by appreciating the rights they helped win, by remaining vigilant against any systems or practices that would deny people control over their own property and their own lives. Sweet dreams and good night.